5 on Treasure Island by Enid Blyton. "Mother, have you heard about our summer holidays yet?" said Julian at the breakfast table. "Can we go to Polzeath as usual?" "I'm afraid not," said his mother. "They're quite full up this year." "Cheer up," said Daddy. "I dare say we'll find somewhere else just as good. And anyway, Mother and I won't be able to go with you this year. Has Mother told you?"
"No," said Anne. "Oh, Mother, is it true? Can't you really come with us on our holidays?"
"Well, this time, Daddy wants me to go to Scotland with him," said Mother, "all by ourselves. And we thought it would be rather fun for you to have a holiday on your own too. But now that you can't go to Polzeath, I really don't know quite where to send you." "What about Quentin's?" Daddy said suddenly. Quentin was his brother, the children's uncle. They'd only seen him once and had been rather frightened of him. He was a very tall, frowning man, a clever scientist who spent all his time studying. He lived by the sea, but that was about all that the children knew of him. "Quentin?" said Mother, pursing up her lips. "Whatever made you think of him?" "Well," said Daddy, "I had to see Quentin's wife in town the other day about a business matter, and I don't think things are going too well for them. Fanny said that she'd be quite glad if she could hear of 1 or 2 people to live with her for a while, to bring a little money in. It might be just the thing for the children." "Yes, and she has a child of her own, hasn't she?" said the children's mother. "Let me see. What's her name? Something funny. Yes, Georgina. How old would she be? About 11, I should think." "Same age as me," said Dick. "Fancy having a cousin we've never seen." The children began to feel rather excited. It would be fun to go to a place they'd never been to before and stay with an unknown cousin. "Oh, Daddy, do telephone to Aunt Fanny and ask her if we can go there," cried Dick. "I just feel as if it's the right place somehow. It sounds sort of adventurous." "You always say that wherever you go," said Daddy with a laugh. "All right, I'll ring up now and see if there's any chance." He went out into the hall and they heard him putting the call through. "I hope it's all right for us," said Julian. "I wonder what Georgina's like. Funny name, isn't it? So, she's 11, a year younger than I am, same age as you, Dick, and a year older than you, Anne. She ought to fit in with us all right. The 4 of us ought to have a fine time together." Daddy came back in about 10 minutes' time. He smiled round at them. "Well, that's settled," he said. "Your Aunt Fanny is delighted about it. Only you'll have to be careful not to disturb your Uncle Quentin. He's working very hard, and he isn't very good-tempered when he's disturbed." "We'll be as quiet as mice in the house," said Dick. "Honestly, we will." "Oh, goody, goody. When are we going, Daddy?" "Next week, if Mother can manage it," said Daddy. Mother nodded her head. "Yes," she said. "There's nothing much to get ready for them, just bathing suits and jerseys and shorts. They all wear the same." "Daddy, are we going by train or by car?" Dick asked. "By car," said Daddy. "We can pile everything into the boot." "Well, what about Tuesday?" "That would suit me well," said Mother. "Then we could take the children down, come back, and start off for Scotland on the Friday. Yes, we'll arrange for Tuesday." The week seemed a very long time in going, but at last Tuesday did come. Dick and Julian, who shared a room, woke up at about the same moment and stared out of the window. "It's a lovely day, hooray!" cried Julian, leaping out of bed. "Let's wake Anne." Anne slept in the next room. Julian ran in and shook her. "Wake up, it's Tuesday, and the sun's shining." Anne woke up with a jump and stared at Julian joyfully. "It's come at last," she said. "I thought it never would." They started soon after breakfast. Mother sat in front with Daddy, and the 3 children sat behind, their feet on 2 suitcases. In the luggage place at the back of the car were all kinds of odds and ends, and 1 small trunk. Along the crowded London roads they went, slowly at first, and then, as they left the town behind, more quickly. Soon they were right out into the open country, and the car sped along fast. The children sang songs to themselves, as they always did when they were happy. "Are we picnicking soon?" asked Anne. "Yes," said Mother, "but not yet. It's only 11 o'clock. We shan't have lunch till at least 12:30, Anne." "Oh, gracious," said Anne. "I know I can't last out till then."
So her mother handed her some chocolate, and she and the boys munched happily, watching the hills, woods and fields as the car sped by. The picnic was lovely. They had it on the top of a hill in a sloping field that looked down into a sunny valley. The children ate enormously, and Mother said that they'd have to go to a cafe somewhere because they'd eaten all the tea sandwiches as well as the lunch ones. "What time shall we be at Aunt Fanny's?" asked Julian, finishing up the very last sandwich and wishing there were more. "Oh, about 6 o'clock with luck," said Daddy. The car seemed to eat up the miles as it purred along. Tea time came, and then the 3 children began to feel excited all over again. "We must watch out for the sea," said Dick. "I can smell it somewhere near." He was right. The car suddenly topped a hill, and there was the shining blue sea, calm and smooth in the evening sun. The 3 children gave a yell. "There it is!" "We shan't be more than 20 minutes now before we're at Kirin Bay," said Daddy. "We've made good time. You'll see the bay soon. It's quite a big one, with a funny sort of island at the entrance of the bay." The children looked out for it as they drove along the coast, and then Julian gave a shout. "There it is! That must be Kirin Bay!" "And look at the rocky little island guarding the entrance of the bay," said Dick. "I'd like to visit that." "Well, I've no doubt you will," said Mother. Kirin Cottage stood on the low cliff overlooking the bay and was a very old house indeed. It wasn't really a cottage, but quite a big house, built of old white stone. Roses climbed over the front of it, and the garden was gay with flowers. The children's aunt came running out of the old wooden door. "Welcome to Kirin," she cried. "Hello, all of you. It's lovely to see you. And what big children!" There were kisses all round, and then the children went into the house. It felt old and rather mysterious somehow, and the furniture was very beautiful. "Where's Georgina?" asked Anne, looking round for her unknown cousin. "Oh, the naughty girl," said her aunt. "Now she's gone off somewhere. I must tell you, children, you may find George a bit difficult at first. She's always been one on her own, you know." "Do you call her George?" asked Anne in surprise. "I thought her name was Georgina." "So it is," said her aunt, "but George hates being a girl, and we have to call her George as if she was a boy. The naughty girl won't answer if we call her Georgina." Uncle Quentin appeared. He was very tall, very dark, and with a rather fierce frown on his wide forehead. "Hello, Quentin," said Daddy. "I hope these 3 won't disturb you very much in your work." "Quentin is working on a very difficult book," said Aunt Fanny, "but I've given him a room all to himself on the other side of the house." Their uncle looked at the 3 children and nodded to them. The frown didn't come off his face, and they all felt a little scared. "Where's George?" he said in a deep voice. "Gone off somewhere again," said Aunt Fanny, vexed. "I told her she was to stay here and meet her cousins." "She wants spanking," said Uncle Quentin. The children couldn't quite make out whether he was joking or not. There was no room at Kirin Cottage for Mother and Daddy to stay the night, so after supper they left to stay at a hotel in the nearest town. They would drive back to London immediately after breakfast the next day. So they said goodbye to the children that night. The children felt a bit lonely as they saw the big car disappear round the corner of the road, but Aunt Fanny took them upstairs to show them their bedrooms, and they soon forgot to be sad. The 2 boys were to sleep together in a room with slanting ceilings at the top of the house. It had a marvellous view of the bay. Anne was to sleep with Georgina in a smaller room. It had windows that looked over the moors at the back of the house, and one side window looked over the sea. It was a nice room, and red roses nodded their heads in at the window. "I do wish Georgina would come," Anne said to her aunt. "I want to see what she's like." "Well, she's a funny little girl," said her aunt. "Once she makes friends with you, she will always be your friend. But she finds it very difficult indeed to make friends, which is a great pity." "I wonder where Georgina is," said Anne to herself, when she'd said good-night to the boys and went to her room. "Isn't she odd, not waiting to welcome us, and not coming in to supper, and not even in yet?" All the 3 children were fast asleep before Georgina came up to bed. They didn't hear her open Anne's door. They were so tired that they heard nothing at all until the sun awoke them in the morning. When Anne awoke, she couldn't at first think where she was. She lay in her little bed and looked up at the ceiling and at the red roses that nodded at the open window, and suddenly remembered all in a rush where she was. Then she looked across at the other bed. In it lay the figure of another child, curled up under the bedclothes. Anne could just see the top of a curly head, and that was all. When the figure stirred a little, Anne spoke.
"I say, are you Georgina?"
The child in the opposite bed sat up and looked across at Anne. She had very short, curly hair, almost as short as a boy's. Her face was burnt a dark brown with the sun, and her very blue eyes looked as bright as forget-me-nots in her face. But her mouth was rather sulky, and she had a frown like her father's.
"No," she said, "I'm not Georgina."
"Oh," said Anne in surprise. "Then who are you?"
"I'm George," said the girl. "I shall only answer if you call me George. I hate being a girl. I won't be. I don't like doing the things that girls do. I like doing the things that boys do. I can climb better than any boy, and swim faster too. I can sail a boat as well as any fisher boy on the coast. You're to call me George."
"Oh," said Anne, thinking that her new cousin was most extraordinary.
"All right. I don't care what I call you. Anyway, you look like a boy."
"Do I really?" said George, the frown leaving her face for a moment. The two girls stared at one another for a while.
"Don't you simply hate being a girl?" asked George. "No, of course not," said Anne. "You see, I do like pretty frocks, and I love my dolls, and you can't do that if you're a boy." "Pooh! Fancy bothering about pretty frocks," said George in a scornful voice.
Anne felt offended.
"You're not very polite," she said. "You won't find that my brothers take much notice of you if you act as if you know everything. They're real boys, not pretend boys like you." "Well, if they're going to be nasty to me, I shan't take any notice of them," said George, jumping out of bed. "I didn't want any of you to come anyway. I'm quite happy on my own. Now I've got to put up with a silly girl who likes frocks and dolls and two stupid boy cousins."
Anne said no more, but got dressed. She put on her grey jeans and a red jersey. George put on jeans too and a boy's jersey. Just as they were ready, the boys hammered on their door.
"Aren't you ready? Is Georgina there? Cousin Georgina, come out and see us."
George flung open the door and marched out with her head high. She took no notice of the two boys at all. She stalked downstairs.
"She won't answer if you call her Georgina," explained Anne. "She's awfully strange, I think."
They were all hungry. The smell of bacon and eggs was very good. They ran down the stairs and said good morning to their aunt. Their uncle was sitting at the head of the table reading his paper. He nodded at the children. George was there, buttering a piece of toast. She scowled at the three children. "Don't look like that, George," said her mother. "You must take your cousins to see the bay this morning and show them the best places to bathe." "I'm going fishing," said George. Her father looked up at once. "You are not," he said. "You're going to show a few good manners for a change and take your cousins to the bay. Do you hear me?" "Yes," said George with a scowl exactly like her father's.
"Oh, we can go to the bay by ourselves all right if George is going fishing," said Anne at once, thinking that it would be nice not to have George if she was in a bad temper. "George will do exactly as she's told," said her father. "If she doesn't, I shall deal with her." So, after breakfast, 4 children got ready to go down to the beach. An easy path led down to the bay, and they ran down happily. Even George lost her frown as she felt the warmth of the sun and saw the dancing sparkles on the blue sea. "You go fishing if you want to," said Anne when they were down on the beach. "We won't tell tales on you. We've got ourselves for company, and if you don't want to be with us, you needn't." "But we'd like you to stay all the same, if you'd like to be with us," said Julian generously. He thought George was rude and ill-mannered, but he couldn't help rather liking the look of the straight-backed, short-haired little girl with her brilliant blue eyes and sulky mouth. George stared at him. "I'll see," she said. "I don't make friends with people just because they're my cousins. I only make friends with people if I like them."
"So do we," said Julian. "We may not like you, of course." "Oh," said George, as if that thought hadn't occurred to her. Anne was staring out over the blue bay. At the entrance to it lay a curious rocky island with what looked like an old ruined castle on the top of it.
"Isn't that a funny place?" she said. "I wonder what it's called." "It's called Kirin Island," said George. "It's a lovely place to go to. If you like, I may take you there some day, but I don't promise. The only way to get there is by boat." "Who does it belong to?" asked Julian. "It belongs to me," George said. "At least it will belong to me some day. It will be my very own island and my very own castle."
The three children stared at George in the greatest surprise. George stared back at them.
"What do you mean?" said Dick at last. "Kirin Island can't belong to you. You're just boasting." "No, I'm not," said George. "You ask Mother. If you're not going to believe what I say, I won't tell you a word more. But I don't tell untruths."
Julian scratched his head and looked at George. How could she possibly be telling the truth? "Well, of course we'll believe you," he said, "but it does sound a bit extraordinary, you know. Really it does. Children don't usually own islands, even funny little ones like that."
"It isn't a funny little island," said George fiercely. "It's lovely. There are rabbits there as tame as can be, and the big cormorants sit on the other side, and all kinds of gulls go there. The castle is wonderful too, even if it is all in ruins."
"It sounds fine," said Dick.
"How does it all belong to you, Georgina?"
George glared at him and didn't answer.
"Sorry," said Dick hastily. "I didn't mean to call you Georgina."
"Go on, George. Tell us how the island belongs to you," said Julian, slipping his arm through his sulky little cousin's. She pulled away from him at once.
"Don't do that," she said. "I'm not sure that I want to make friends with you yet."
All right, said Julian, losing patience. "Be enemies or anything you like, we don't care. But we like your mother awfully, and we don't want her to think that we won't make friends with you."
"Do you like my mother?"
said George, her bright blue eyes softening a little.
"Yes, she's a dear, isn't she?
Well, all right. I'll tell you how Kirin Castle belongs to me." They all sat down in a sandy corner of the beach. George looked across at the little island in the bay. "It's like this," she said. "Years ago, my mother's people owned nearly all the land round here, and then they got poor and had to sell most of it. But they could never sell that little island because nobody thought it worth anything, especially as the castle had been in ruins for years. All that's left of what my mother's family owned is our own house, Kirin Cottage, a farm a little way off, and Kirin Island. Mother says that when I'm grown up, it will be mine. She's sort of given it to me, and I don't let anyone go there unless they get my permission." The three children stared at her. "Oh, Georgina! George," said Dick. "I do think you're lucky. It looks such a nice island. I hope you'll be friends with us and take us there one day soon. You simply can't imagine how we'd love it." "Well, I might," said George. The four children looked out over the bay to where the island lay in the distance. The tide was going out. It almost looked as if they could wade over to the island. Dick asked if it was possible. "No," said George. "It's only possible to get to it by boat. It's farther out than it looks, and the water is very, very deep. There are rocks all about too. You have to know exactly where to row a boat, or you bump into them. It's a dangerous bit of coast here. There are lots of wrecks about." "Wrecks?" said Julian, his eyes shining. "I say, are there any to see?" "There's one on the other side of the island. It's deep down in the water. You can just see the broken mast if you row over it on a calm day and look down into the water. That wreck really belongs to me too." This time the children really could hardly believe George, but she nodded her head firmly. "Yes," she said. "It was a ship belonging to one of my great-great-great-grandfathers, or someone like that. He was bringing gold, big bars of gold, back in his ship, and it got wrecked off Kirin Island." "Ooh, "What happened to the gold?" asked Anne, her eyes round and big. "Nobody knows," said George. "I expect it was stolen out of the ship. Divers have been down to see, of course, but they couldn't find any gold." "Golly, this does sound exciting," said Julian. "I wish I could see the wreck."
"Well, we might perhaps go this afternoon when the tide is right down," said George. "Oh, how wonderful," said Anne. "I do so want to see a real live wreck." The others laughed. "Well, it won't be very alive," said Dick. "I say, George, what about a bathe?" "I must go and get Timothy first," said George. She got up. "Who's Timothy?" asked Dick. "Can you keep a secret?" asked George. "We're not sneaks," said Julian. "Timothy is my very, very greatest friend," said George. "I couldn't do without him. But Mother and Father don't like him, so I have to keep him secret. I'll go and fetch him." She ran off up the cliff path. "Who in the world can Timothy be?" wondered Julian. "Some fisher boy, I suppose, that George's parents don't approve of." Soon they heard George's clear voice coming down from the cliff behind them. "Come on, Timothy, come on." They looked to see what Timothy was like. They saw no fisher boy, but instead a big brown mongrel dog with an absurdly long tail and a big wide mouth that really seemed to grin. "This is Timothy," George said. "Don't you think he's simply perfect?" As a dog, Timothy was far from perfect. He was the wrong shape, his head was too big, his ears were too pricked, his tail was too long, and it was quite impossible to say what kind of dog he was supposed to be. But he was such a mad, friendly, laughable creature that the children adored him at once. "Oh, you darling," said Anne, and got a lick on the nose. "I wish I had a dog like this," said Julian, who really loved dogs and had always wanted one of his own. "Oh, George, he's fine. Aren't you proud of him?" The little girl smiled, and her face altered at once and became sunny and pretty. She sat down on the sand, and her dog cuddled up to her, licking her wherever he could find a bare piece of skin. "I love him awfully," she said. "I found him out on the moors when he was just a pup a year ago, and I took him home. At first Mother liked him, but when he grew bigger, he got terribly naughty." "What did he do?" asked Anne. "He chewed up everything he could. A new rug Mother had bought, her nicest hat, Father's slippers, some of his papers and things like that. And he barked too. I liked his bark, but Father didn't. He said it nearly drove him mad. He hit Timothy, and that made me angry, so I was awfully rude to him." "Did you get spanked?" asked Anne. George looked out over the bay. "Well, it doesn't matter what punishment I got," she said. "But the worst part of all was when Father said I couldn't keep Timothy any more, and Mother backed Father up and said Tim must go. I cried for days. And I never do cry, you know, because boys don't." "Boys do cry sometimes," began Anne, looking at Dick, who'd been a bit of a crybaby 3 or 4 years back. Dick gave her a sharp nudge, and she said no more. George looked at Anne. "Boys don't," she said obstinately. "And I always try not to cry myself. It's so babyish. But I just couldn't help it when Timothy had to go. He cried too." "Do you mean he cried real tears?" asked Anne. "No, not quite," said George. "He's too brave for that. He cried with his voice, howled and looked so miserable that he nearly broke my heart." "What happened then?" asked Julian. "I went to Alf, a fisher boy I know," said George, "and I asked him if he'd keep Tim for me if I paid him all the pocket money I get. He said he would, and so he does. That's why I never have any money to spend. It all has to go on Tim. He seems to eat an awful lot. Don't you, Tim?" "Ruff," said Tim, and rolled over on his back, all his shaggy legs in the air. Julian tickled him. The tinkle of an ice cream man's bell was heard in the distance. Julian felt in his pocket. He jumped up and rushed off, jingling his money. In a few minutes he was back again, carrying 4 fat chocolate ice cream bars. He gave one to Dick and one to Anne, and then held out one to George. She looked at it longingly, but shook her head. "No thanks," she said. "I haven't any money to buy one myself, and it's mean to take from people if you can't give even a little back." "You can take from us," said Julian, trying to put the ice into George's brown hand. "We're your cousins." "No thanks," said George again, "though I do think it's nice of you." Julian frowned as he tried to think of a way to make the obstinate girl take the ice. "Listen," he said, "you've got a lot of things we'd like to share if only you'd let us. You share those with us, and let us share things like ices with you. See?" "What things?" asked George. "You've got a dog," said Julian. "We'd love to share him with you, he's such a darling. And you've got a lovely island, and you've got a wreck. Ices and sweets aren't so good as those things, but it would be nice to make a bargain and share with each other." Timothy looked up at Julian and saw that he was offering something nice and chocolatey to George. He jumped up and licked the boy with his friendly tongue. "There you are, you see. Tim wants to be shared," said Julian with a laugh. "It would be nice for him to have 3 new friends." "Yes, it would," said George, giving in suddenly and taking the chocolate bar. "Thank you, Julian. I will share with you, but promise that you'll never tell anyone at home that I'm still keeping Timothy." "Of course we'll promise," said Julian. They all had a bathe that morning, and the boys found that George was a much better swimmer than they were. She was very strong and very fast, and she could swim underwater too, holding her breath for ages. They were all very hungry at lunchtime. George returned Timothy to Alf, and then they went back up the cliff path, hoping that there would be lots to eat. And there was. Cold meat and salad, plum pie and custard, and cheese afterwards. "What are you going to do this afternoon?" asked George's mother. "George is going to take us out in a boat to see the wreck on the other side of the island," said Anne. Her aunt looked most surprised. "George is going to take you?" she said. "Why, George, what's come over you? You've never taken a single person before, though I've asked you to dozens of times." George said nothing, but went on eating her plum pie. "Well, George, I'm pleased you want to try and do what your father said," began her mother again. But George shook her head. "I'm not doing it because I've got to," she said. "I'm doing it because I want to. I wouldn't take anyone to see my wreck, not even the Queen of England, if I didn't like them." Her mother laughed. "Well, it's good news that you like your cousins," she said. "I hope they like you." "Oh, yes," said Anne eagerly. "We do like George, and we like She was just about to say that they liked Timothy too, when she got such a kick on her ankle that she cried out in pain, and the tears came to her eyes. "George, why did you kick Anne like that?" cried her mother. "Leave the table at once." George left the table without a word. She had just taken herself a piece of bread and cut herself some cheese. It was all left on her plate. The other 3 stared at it in distress. Anne was upset. "Oh, please call George back," she said. "She didn't mean to kick me. It was an accident." But her aunt was very angry with George. "Finish your meal," she said to the others. They finished the meal in silence. Their aunt went to see if Uncle Quentin wanted some more pie. He was having his meal in the study by himself. As soon as she'd gone out of the room, Anne picked up the bread and cheese from George's plate and went out into the garden. George was lying on her back under a big tree. Anne went up to her. "I'm sorry I nearly made a mistake, George," she said. "Here's your bread and cheese. I promise I will never forget not to mention Tim ever again." George sat up. "I've a good mind not to take you to see the wreck," she said. "Stupid baby." Anne's heart sank. "Well," she said, "you needn't take me, of course. But you might take the boys, George. After all, they didn't do anything silly. And anyway, you gave me an awful kick. Look at the bruise." George looked at it. Then she looked at Anne. "But wouldn't you be miserable if I took Julian and Dick without you?" she asked. "Of course," said Anne. "But I don't want to make them miss a treat, even if I have to." Then George did a surprising thing for her. She gave Anne a hug. "It's all right," she said gruffly, taking the bread and cheese. "You were nearly very silly, and I gave you a kick, so it's all square.
Of course you can come this afternoon." 15 minutes later, 4 children ran down to the beach. By a boat was a brown-faced fisher boy, about 14 years old. He had Timothy with him. "Boat's all ready, Master George," he said with a grin, "and Tim's ready too." "Thanks," said George, and told the others to get in. Timothy jumped in too, his big tail wagging 19 to the dozen. George pushed the boat off into the surf and then jumped in herself. She took the oars. She rowed splendidly, and the boat shot along over the blue bay. Timothy stood at the prow and barked whenever a wave reared its head. "Isn't it nice to have a dog with us?" said Anne, anxious to make up for her mistake. "I do so like him." "Ruff," said Timothy. "I'm sure he knew what I said," said Anne in delight. "Of course he did," said George. "He understands every single word." They drew near to the island, and the children saw that there were sharp rocks all around it. Unless anyone knew exactly the way to take, no boat or ship could possibly land on the shore of the rocky little island. In the very middle of it, on a low hill, rose the ruined castle. "It looks awfully mysterious," said Julian. "Wouldn't it be fun to spend a night or two there?" George stopped rowing. Her face lighted up. "I say," she said in delight, "do you know, I never thought how lovely that would be." "Can't we land there this afternoon?" asked Julian. "No, not if you want to see the wreck," said George. "We've got to get back for tea today, and it'll take all our time to row round to the other side and back." "Well, I'd like to see the wreck," said Julian. "Here, let me take the oars for a bit, George. You can't do all the rowing." "I can," said George, "but I'd quite enjoy lying back in the boat for a change. Look, I'll just take you by this rocky bit, and then you can take the oars till we come to another awkward place. Honestly, the rocks round this bay are simply dreadful." George and Julian changed places in the boat. Julian rowed well, but not as strongly as George. The boat sped along, rocking smoothly. They went right round the island and saw the castle from the other side. It looked more ruined on the side that faced the sea. "The strong winds come from the open sea," explained George. "There's not really much left of it this side, except piles of stones. But there's a good little harbour in a little cove, for those who know how to find it." George took the oars after a while and rowed steadily out a little beyond the island. Then she stopped and looked back towards the shore. "How do you know when you're over the wreck?" asked Julian. "Well, do you see that church tower on the mainland?" asked George. "And do you see the tip of that hill over there? Well, when you get them exactly in line with one another, between the 2 towers of the castle on the island, you're pretty well over the wreck." The children saw that the tip of the far-off hill and the church tower were practically in line when they looked at them between the 2 old towers of the island castle. They looked eagerly down into the sea to see if they could spy the wreck. Timothy looked down too, his head on one side, his ears cocked, just as if he knew what he was looking for. "We're not exactly over it," said George, looking down too. "Wait, I'll row a bit to the left." "Ruff," said Timothy suddenly and wagged his tail. And at the same moment the 3 children saw something deep down in the water. "It's the wreck," said Julian. "I can see a bit of broken mast. Look, Dick, look." All 4 children, and the dog too, gazed down earnestly into the clear water. After a little while they could make out the outline of a dark hulk, out of which the broken mast stood. "It's a bit on one side," said Julian. "Poor old ship. George, I wish I could dive down and get a closer look at it." "Well, why don't you?" said George. "You've got your swimming trunks on. I'll come with you if you like, if Dick can keep the boat round about here." The girl stripped off her jeans and jersey, and Julian did the same. They both had on bathing costumes underneath. George took a beautiful header off the end of the boat, deep down into the water. The others watched her swimming strongly downwards. After a bit she came up, almost bursting for breath. "Well, I went almost down to the wreck," she said. "It's just the same as it always is, seaweedy and covered with limpets and things. I wish I could get right into the ship itself, but I never have enough breath for that. You go down now, Julian." So down Julian went. but he was not so good at swimming deep underwater as George was, and he couldn't go down so far. He knew how to open his eyes underwater, so he was able to take a good look at the deck of the wreck. It looked very forlorn and strange. He was glad to go to the top of the water again and take deep breaths of air and feel the warm sunshine on his shoulders. He climbed into the boat. Golly, wouldn't I just love to see that wreck properly? You know, go down under the deck into the cabins and look around. And oh, suppose we could really find the boxes of gold. That's impossible, said George. I told you, proper divers have already gone down and found nothing. What's the time? I say, we'll be late if we don't hurry back now. They did hurry back and managed to be only 5 minutes late for tea. Afterwards they went for a walk over the moors, with Timothy at their heels, and by the time that bedtime came, they were all so sleepy that they could hardly keep their eyes open. Well, good night, George, said Anne, snuggling down into her bed. We've had a lovely day, thanks to you. And I've had a lovely day too, said George, rather gruffly. Thanks to you. The children's aunt arranged a picnic for them the next day. They all went off to a little cove not far off, where they could bathe and paddle to their heart's content. George didn't want to go, not because she disliked picnics, but because she couldn't take her dog. Her mother went with the children, and George had to pass a whole day without her beloved Timothy. Bad luck, said Julian, who guessed what she was brooding about. I can't think why you don't tell your mother about old Tim. I'm sure she wouldn't mind you letting someone else keep him for you. I'm not going to tell anybody except you, said George. I get into awful trouble at home always. I dare say it's my fault, but I get a bit tired of it. You see, Daddy doesn't make much money with the books he writes, and he's always wanting to give Mother and me things he can't afford, so that makes him bad-tempered. He wants to send me away to a good school, but he hasn't got the money. I'm glad. I don't want to go away to school. I like being here. I couldn't bear to part with Timothy. You like boarding school, said Anne. It's fun. No, it isn't, said George obstinately. I should hate it. No, you wouldn't, said Anne. It would be good for you, I should think. If you start telling me what is good for me, I shall hate you, said George, suddenly looking very fierce. All right, said Julian, beginning to laugh. My goodness, how you do go up in smoke. Honestly, I believe that anyone could light a cigarette from the sparks that fly from your eyes. That made George laugh, though she didn't want to. They went off to bathe in the sea for the 5th time that day. Soon they were all splashing about happily, and George found time to help Anne to swim. The little girl hadn't got the right stroke, and George felt really proud when she'd taught her. As they were going home, George spoke to Julian. Could you say that you want to go and buy a stamp or something, she said. Then I could go with you and just have a peep at old Tim. Right, said Julian. I'll just go and tell Aunt Fanny. He ran up to his aunt. Do you mind if I go and buy some ice creams? He asked. We haven't had one today. I won't be long. Can George go with me? I don't expect she'll want to, said his aunt. George, come with me, yelled Julian, setting off to the little village. George soon caught him up and smiled gratefully at him. Thanks, she said. You go and get the ice creams and I'll have a look at Tim. They parted. Julian bought 4 ice creams and turned to go home. He waited about for George, who came running up after a few minutes. Her face was glowing. He's all right, she said, and you can't imagine how pleased he was to see me. I say, another ice cream for me. I'll have to share something with you quickly. What about going to my island tomorrow? Golly, said Julian, his eyes shining. That would be marvellous. The children were sent to wash themselves and get tidy before supper. They talked eagerly about the visit to the island next day. Their aunt heard them and smiled. Well, I must say I'm pleased that George is going to share something with you, she said. Would you like to take your dinner there and spend the day? Oh, Aunt Fanny, that would be marvellous, cried Anne. George looked up. Are you coming too, Mother? She asked. You don't sound at all as if you want me to, said her mother in a hurt tone. "You looked cross yesterday, too, when you found I was coming on the picnic." "No, I shan't come tomorrow, but I'm sure your cousins must think you are a strange girl never to want your mother to go with you." George said nothing. The other children said nothing too. They knew perfectly well that it wasn't that George didn't want her mother to go. It was just that she wanted Timothy with her. "Anyway, I couldn't come," went on Aunt Fanny. "I've some gardening to do." The children looked eagerly at the weather the next day when they got up.
"Isn't it a marvellous day?" said Anne to George as they dressed. "I'm so looking forward to going to the island."
"Well, honestly, I think really we oughtn't to go," said George.
"Oh, but why?" cried Anne in dismay.
"I think there's going to be a storm," said George, looking out to the southwest.
"But George, why do you say that?" said Anne impatiently. "Look at that sun, and there's hardly a cloud in the sky."
"The wind is wrong," said George. "And can't you see the little white tops to the waves out there by my island? That's always a bad sign."
"Oh, George, it will be the biggest disappointment of our lives if we don't go today," said Anne.
"All right, we'll go. But mind, if a storm does come, you're not to be a baby." They set off with food in 2 kit bags. The first thing they did was to fetch Tim. He was tied up in the Fisher boy's backyard. The boy himself was there and grinned at George. "Morning, Master George," he said. It seemed so quaint to the other children to hear Georgina called Master George. "Tim's been barking his head off for you. I guess he knew you were coming for him today." "Of course he did," said George, untying him. He at once went completely mad and tore round and round the children, his tail down and his ears flat. Then he sobered down and ran lovingly by George as they all made their way to the beach. They got into the boat and George pushed off. The Fisher boy waved to them. "You won't be very long, will you?" he called. "There's a storm blowing up."
"I know," shouted back George, "but we'll get back before it begins."
The children watched the island coming closer and closer. It looked even more exciting than it had the other day. "George, where are you going to land?" asked Julian. "I simply can't imagine how you know your way in and out of these awful rocks." "I'm going to land at that little cove I told you about," said George. "There's only one way to it, but I know it very well. It's hidden away on the east side of the island." The girl cleverly worked her boat in and out of the rocks, and suddenly, as it rounded a low wall of sharp rocks, the children saw the cove she'd spoken of. It was like a natural little harbour, and was a smooth inlet of water running up to a stretch of sand, sheltered between high rocks. The boat slid into the inlet and at once stopped rocking, for here the water was like glass and had hardly a ripple. George pulled the boat high up onto the sand. "Why so far up?" said Julian, helping her. "The tide's almost in, isn't it? Surely it won't come as high as this." "I told you I thought a storm was coming," said George. "If one does, the waves simply tear up this inlet, and we don't want to lose our boat, do we?"
"Let's explore the island! Let's explore the island!" yelled Anne,
who was now at the top of the little natural harbour.
"Oh, do come on!"
They all followed her. Rabbits were everywhere. They scuttled about as the children appeared, but did not go into their holes. "Aren't they awfully tame?" said Julian.
"Well, nobody ever comes here but me," said George, "and I don't frighten them. Tim, if you go after the rabbits, I'll spank you."
Tim turned big, sorrowful eyes onto George. He and George agreed about every single thing except rabbits. But he held himself in and walked solemnly by the children, his eyes watching the lolloping rabbits longingly. "There's the castle," said Julian. "Shall we explore that now? Oh, I do want to." The children gazed at the enormous old archway, now half broken down. Behind it were ruined stone steps leading towards the centre of the castle. "It had strong walls all round it with 2 towers," said George. "One tower is almost gone, as you can see, but the other is not so bad. The jackdaws build there every year." As they came near the better tower, the jackdaws circled round them with loud cries. "This is the centre of the castle," said George as they entered through a ruined doorway into what looked like a great yard, whose stone floor was now overgrown with grass and weeds. "Here is where the people used to live. You can see where the rooms were. Look, there's one almost whole there. Go through that little door and you'll see it." They trooped through a doorway and found themselves in a dark, stone-walled, stone-roofed room with a space at one end where a fireplace must have been. 2 slit-like windows lighted the room. "What a pity it's all broken down," said Julian, wandering out again. "That room seems to be the only one quite whole. Was there an upstairs to the castle, George?" "Of course," said George, "but the steps that led up are gone. Look, you can see part of an upstairs room there, by the jackdaw tower. You can't get up to it, though, because I've tried. The stones crumble away so." "Were there any dungeons?" asked Dick. "I don't know," said George. "I expect so, but nobody could find them now. Everywhere is so overgrown." Big blackberry bushes grew here and there, and a few gorse bushes forced their way into gaps and corners. Coarse green grass sprang everywhere, and pink thrift grew its cushions in holes and crannies. "Well, I think it's a perfectly lovely place," said Anne. "Perfectly and absolutely lovely." "Do you really?" said George. "Oh, I'm so glad. Look, we're right on the other side of the island now, facing the sea. Do you see those rocks with those big birds sitting there?" The children looked. They saw some rocks sticking up, with great black shining birds sitting on them. "They are cormorants," said George. "They've caught plenty of fish for their dinner, and they're sitting there digesting it. Hello, they're all flying away. I wonder why." From the southwest there suddenly came an ominous rumble. "Thunder," said George. "That's the storm. It's coming sooner than I thought." Another rumble came. It sounded like a big dog growling in the sky. Tim heard it and growled back. "My goodness, we're in for it now," said George, half alarmed. "We can't get back in time, that's certain." The sky had been blue when they started out. Now it was overcast, and the clouds seemed to hang very low indeed. They scudded along as if someone was chasing them, and the wind howled. "It's beginning to rain," said Julian. "We'd better shelter, hadn't we, George?" "Yes, we will in a minute," said George. "First, I think we'd better pull our boat up higher still. It's going to be a very bad storm indeed." She and Julian ran to the other side of the island where they'd left the boat. Great waves were already racing right up to it. The 2 children pulled the boat up almost to the top of the low cliff, and George tied it to a stout gorse bush growing there. By now, George and Julian were soaked. "I hope the others have been sensible enough to shelter in that room," said George. They were there all right, looking rather cold and scared. It was very dark there, for the only light came through the 2 slits of windows and the small doorway. "Could we light a fire to make things a bit more cheerful?" said Julian, looking round. "There are plenty of sticks on the ground below the tower. You know, where the jackdaws nest." He dashed out into the rain and ran to the tower. He picked up an armful of sticks and ran back. "Good," said George. "Anyone got any paper to start it, or matches?" "I've got some matches," said Julian, "but nobody's got paper." "Yes," said Anne suddenly. "The sandwiches are wrapped in paper." So they undid the sandwiches and put them neatly on a stone. Then they built up a fire with the paper underneath and the sticks arranged criss-cross on top. Soon there was a fine crackling fire going, and the little room was lighted by dancing flames. It was very dark outside now, for the clouds hung almost low enough to touch the top of the castle tower. What with the howling of the wind and the crashing of the great waves all around the little island, the children could hardly hear themselves speak. "Let's have our dinner," yelled Dick, who was feeling terribly hungry as usual. "We can't do anything much while this storm lasts." They all felt better when they were eating ham sandwiches and drinking ginger beer. The fire flared as more and more sticks caught and gave out quite a pleasant warmth. "We'll take it in turns to fetch sticks," said George. But Anne didn't want to go alone. She was trying her best not to show that she was afraid of the storm, but it was more than she could do to go out of the cosy room into the rain and thunder by herself. The children fed the fire and finished their picnic. When it came to Julian's turn to get more sticks, He disappeared out of the room into the storm. He stood and looked around, the rain wetting his bare head. Julian was not a bit afraid of storms, but he couldn't help feeling rather overawed at this one. The lightning tore the sky in half almost every minute, and the thunder crashed so loudly that it sounded almost as if mountains were falling down all around. The sea's voice could be heard as soon as the thunder stopped, and that was magnificent to hear too. The spray flew so high into the air that it wetted Julian as he stood in the centre of the ruined castle. "I really must see what the waves are like," thought the boy. "If the spray flies right over me here, they must be simply enormous." He made his way out of the castle and climbed up onto part of the ruined wall that had once run all round it. He stood up there, looking out to the open sea. The waves were like great walls of grey-green. They dashed over the rocks that lay all around the island, and spray flew from them, gleaming white in the stormy sky. The boy looked out to sea, marvelling at the really great sight he saw. He stared at the huge waves coming in, and then he saw something rather peculiar. There was something else out on the sea by the rocks beside the waves. Something dark, something big, something that seemed to lurch out of the waves and settle down again. "It can't be a ship," said Julian to himself, his heart beginning to beat fast as he strained his eyes to see through the rain and the spray. "And yet it looks more like a ship than anything else." The dark shape heaved into sight again, and then sank away once more. Julian ran back to the firelit room. "George, Dick, there's something strange out on the rocks. Come and see." The others quickly followed Julian out into the rain. The storm seemed to be passing over now. The rain was not pelting down quite so hard. Julian led the way to the wall on which he had climbed. Everyone climbed up and gazed out to sea. They saw a great tumbled, heaving mass of grey-green water, with waves rearing up everywhere. Anne slipped her arm through Julian's. She felt rather small and scared. "You're all right, Anne," said Julian. "Now, just watch. You'll notice something in a minute." They all watched. At first, they saw nothing. Then suddenly, George saw what Julian meant. "Gracious!" she shouted. "It's a ship! Yes, it is! Is it being wrecked? It's a big ship, not a sailing boat or a fishing smack." The 4 children watched the dark shape lurching here and there in the enormous waves. The sea was bringing the ship nearer to shore. "It'll be dashed onto those rocks," said Julian suddenly. As he spoke, there came a tremendous crashing, splintering sound, and the dark shape of the ship settled down onto the sharp teeth of the rocks on the southwest side of the island. It stayed there, shifting only slightly as the big waves ran under it and lifted it a little. "She's stuck there," said Julian. "She won't move now." As he spoke, a ray of pale sunshine came wavering out through a gap in the thinning clouds. The children felt its welcome warmth. They all stared at the ship on the rocks. "There's something odd about it," said Julian slowly. "Something awfully odd. I've never seen a ship quite like it." George was staring at it with a strange look in her eyes. She turned to face the others. "Julian! Oh, Julian! It's my wreck!" she cried in a high, excited voice. "Don't you see what's happened? The storm has lifted the ship up from the bottom of the sea and has lodged it on those rocks. It's my wreck!" The others saw at once that she was right. No wonder it looked so old and dark and such a strange shape. "George," shouted Julian, "we shall be able to explore it from end to end. We may find the boxes of gold. Oh, George!" George said nothing but stared at the wreck, all kinds of thoughts racing through her mind. Then she turned to Julian. "If only the wreck is still mine, now it's thrown up like this," she said. "I don't know if wrecks belong to the Queen or anyone, like lost treasure does. Do you suppose people will still let me have it for my own, now it's thrown up?" "Well, don't let's tell anyone," said Dick. "Don't be silly," said George. "One of the fishermen is sure to see it." "Well then, we'd better explore it thoroughly ourselves before anyone else does," said Dick eagerly. "No one knows about it yet, only us.
Can't we explore it as soon as the waves go down a bit?" "They won't go down today, that's certain," said George. "The wind is still too strong." "Well, what about tomorrow morning early?" said Julian. "I bet if only we can get into the ship first, we can find anything there is to find." "Yes, I expect we could," said George. "I told you divers have been down and explored the ship as thoroughly as they could, but of course it's difficult to do that properly underwater. We might find something they've missed." The sun was now properly out, and the children's wet clothes dried in its hot rays. They steamed. Even Tim's coat sent up a mist too. He didn't seem to like the wreck at all, but growled deeply at it. "You are funny, Tim," said George, patting him. "It won't hurt you. What do you think it is?" "He probably thinks it's a whale," said Anne with a laugh. All the children felt a little tired after the excitements of the morning. They said very little as they rowed home. Everyone took turns at rowing except Anne, who wasn't strong enough with the oars to row against the tide. They looked back at the island as they left it. They couldn't see the wreck because that was on the opposite side, facing the open sea. "It's just as well it's there," said Julian. "No one can see it yet. Only when a boat goes out to fish will it be seen. And we shall be there as early as any boat goes out. I vote we get up at dawn." "Well, that's pretty early," said George. "Can you wake up? I'm often out at dawn, but you're not used to it." "Of course we can wake up," said Julian. "Well, here we are back at the beach again. I'm so hungry I could eat a whole larder." "Ruff," said Tim, quite agreeing. "I'll have to take Tim to Alf," said George. "You get the boat in, Julian. I'll join you in a few minutes." It wasn't long before all four were sitting down to a good tea. "Did you have an exciting day?" asked their aunt. "Oh, yes," said Anne eagerly. "The storm was grand. It threw up—" Julian and Dick both kicked her under the table. George couldn't reach her, or she most certainly would have kicked her too. Anne stared at the boys angrily with tears in her eyes. "Now what's the matter?" asked Aunt Fanny. "Did somebody kick you, Anne?" "Well, really, this kicking under the table has got to stop. Poor Anne will be covered with bruises." "What did the sea throw up, dear?" "It threw up the most enormous waves," said Anne, looking defiantly at the others. She knew that they thought she was going to say that the sea had thrown up the wreck, but they were wrong. They'd kicked her for nothing. "Sorry for kicking you, Anne," said Julian. "My foot sort of slipped." "So did mine," said Dick. "Yes, Aunt Fanny, it was a magnificent sight on the island. The waves raced up that little inlet, and we had to take our boat almost up to the top of the low cliff there." "I wasn't really afraid of the storm," said Anne. "In fact, I wasn't as afraid of it as Everyone knew perfectly well that Anne was going to mention Timothy, and they all interrupted her at once, speaking very loudly. Julian managed to get a kick in again. "Ooh," said Anne. "The rabbits were so tame," said Julian. "We watched the cormorants," said Dick, and George joined in too, talking at the same time. "The jackdaws made such a noise, chack, 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 all the time." "Well, really, you sound like jackdaws yourself, talking all at once like this," said Aunt Fanny with a laugh. Julian woke first the next morning. He sat up straight in bed and whispered, "Dick, wake up. We're going to see the wreck. Oh, do wake up." Dick woke and grinned at Julian. He leapt out of bed and ran quietly to the girls' room. Both the girls were fast asleep. Dick shook George and then dug Anne in the back. They awoke and sat up. "Buck up," whispered Dick. "The sun is just rising. We'll have to hurry." George's blue eyes shone as she dressed. Anne skipped about quietly, finding her few clothes, just a bathing suit, jeans and jersey, and rubber shoes for her feet. It wasn't many minutes before they were all ready. "Now, not a creak on the stairs, not a cough or a giggle," warned Julian as they stood on the landing. They crept down the stairs and undid the little front door. Not a sound was made. They shut the door quietly and made their way down the garden path to the gate. The gate always creaked, so they climbed over it instead of opening it. The day had a lovely new feeling about it. The clouds were so pink in the bright blue sky, and the sea looked so smooth and fresh. It was impossible to imagine that it had been so rough the day before.
George got her boat. Then she went to get Tim, while the boys hauled the boat down to the sea. Alf, the fisher boy, was surprised to see George so early. He was about to go fishing with his father. "You going fishing too?" he said to her. "My, wasn't that a storm yesterday? I thought you'd be caught in it." "We were," said George. "Come on, Tim, come on." Tim leapt into the boat as soon as he saw it and stood at the stern, his red tongue out, his tail wagging violently. They set off. It was easy to row now because the sea was so calm. They came to the island and rowed round it to the other side. And there was the wreck, piled high on sharp rocks. It had settled down now and did not stir as waves slid under it. It lay a little to one side, and the broken mast, now shorter than before, stuck out at an angle. "How do we get to her?" asked Anne, looking at the mass of ugly, sharp rocks all around. But George knew almost every inch of the coast round her little island. She pulled steadily at the oars and soon came near to the rocks on which the great wreck rested. It was encrusted in shellfish of some kind, and strands of brown and green seaweed hung down. It smelt strange. It had great holes in its side. There were holes in the deck too. Altogether, it looked a sad and forlorn old ship. But to the 4 children, it was the most exciting thing in the whole world. George took a look round. "We'll tie our boat up to the wreck itself," she said, "and we'll get onto the deck quite easily by climbing up the side. Look, Julian, throw this loop of rope over that broken bit of wood there, sticking out from the side." The rope tightened, and the boat was held in position. Then George clambered up the side of the wreck like a monkey. Julian and Dick followed her, but Anne had to be helped up. Soon all 4 were standing on the slanting deck. It was slippery with seaweed, and the smell was very strong indeed. "Well, this was the deck," said George, "and that's where the men got up and down." She pointed to a large hole. They went to it and looked down. The remains of an iron ladder was still there. George looked at it. "I think it's still strong enough to hold us," she said. "I'll go first. Anyone got a torch?" Julian had one. He handed it to George. The children became rather quiet. George swung herself down the ladder. The others followed. The light from the torch showed a very weird sight. The underparts of the ship were low-ceilinged, made of thick oak. The children had to bend their heads to get about. There were places that might have been cabins, though it was difficult to tell, for everything was so battered, sea-drenched and seaweedy. The children slipped about on the seaweed as they went about the inside of the ship. There was a big hold under the cabins, which the children saw by the light of their torch. "That's where the boxes of gold would have been kept, I expect," said Julian. But there was nothing in the hold except fish and water. 1 or 2 barrels floated in the water, but they had burst open and were quite empty. "I expect they were water barrels or barrels of pork or biscuit," said George. "Let's go round the other part of the ship again, where the cabins are." It was a very strange trip round the old wreck. The children were all on the lookout for boxes which might contain bars of gold, but there didn't seem to be one single box of any kind anywhere. They came to a rather bigger cabin than the others. It had a bunk in one corner on which a large crab rested. An old bit of furniture, looking rather like a table with 2 legs, all encrusted with greyish shells, lay against the bunk. "This must have been the captain's own cabin," said Julian. "It's the biggest one. Look, what's that in the corner?" "An old cup," said Anne, picking it up. "And here's half of a saucer. I expect the captain was sitting here having a cup of tea when the ship went down." They turned to go. Julian flashed his torch round the cabin for the last time. He was about to switch it off and follow the others up to the deck above, when he caught sight of something that made him stop. "I say, wait a bit. There's a cupboard here in the wall. Let's see if there's anything in it." The others turned back and looked. They saw what looked like a small cupboard let in level with the wall of the cabin. What had caught Julian's eye was the keyhole. There was no key there, though. Julian tried to prise open the wooden door with his fingers, but it wouldn't move. "It's locked," he said. George took out her big, strong pocket knife and inserted it between the cupboard door and the cabin wall. She forced back the blade, and the lock of the cupboard suddenly snapped. The door swung open, and the children saw a shelf inside with a few things on it. There was a wooden box swollen by the seawater in which it had lain for years. There were 2 or 3 things that looked like old, pulpy books. There was some sort of drinking vessel cracked in half. "Nothing very interesting, except the box," said Julian, and he picked it up. He and George tried their best to force the lock of the box. On the top of it were stamped initials, H.J.K. "I expect those were the captain's initials," said Dick. "No, they were the initials of my great-great-great-grandfather," said George, her eyes shining. "I've heard all about him. His name was Henry John Kirin. This was his ship, you know. This must have been his private box in which he kept his papers or diaries. Oh, we simply must open it." But it was quite impossible to force the lid up with the tools they had there. They soon gave it up. Julian picked up the box to carry it to the boat. "We'll open it at home," he said, his voice sounding rather excited. "We'll get a hammer or something and get it open somehow. Oh, George, this really is a find." They went up on deck, climbing the old iron ladder. As soon as they got there, they saw that others besides themselves had discovered the wreck. "Golly, half the fishing smacks of the bay have discovered it," cried Julian, looking round. The fishermen were looking at the wreck in wonder. When they saw the children on board, they yelled loudly.
"Ahoy there! What's that ship?" "It's the old wreck,"
yelled back Julian.
"She was thrown up yesterday in the storm."
"Don't say any more," said George, frowning. "It's my wreck. I don't want sightseers on it."
So no more was said, and the 4 children got into their boat and rowed home as fast as they could. It was past their breakfast time. They might get a good scolding. They did get a good scolding. They had to go without half their breakfast too, because Uncle Quentin said that children who came in so late didn't deserve hot bacon and eggs, only toast and marmalade. It was very sad. They had hidden the box under a bed in the boys' room. Tim had been left with the fisher boy, or rather had been tied up in his backyard, for Alf had gone out fishing, and was even now gazing from his father's boat at the strange wreck. "We can make a bit of money taking sightseers out to this wreck," said Alf. And before the day was out, scores of interested people had seen the old wreck from the decks of motorboats and fishing smacks. George was furious about it, but she couldn't do anything. The first thing that the children did after breakfast was to fetch the precious box and take it out to the tool shed in the garden. Julian found a chisel and decided that it would be just the thing to force the box open. He tried, but the tool slipped and jabbed his fingers. Then he tried other things, but the box obstinately refused to open.
"I know what to do," said Anne at last. "Let's take it to the top of the house and throw it down to the ground. It would burst open then, I expect."
The others thought over the idea.
"It might be worth trying," said Julian.
He carried the box up to the top of the house. He went to the attic and opened the window there. The others were down below, waiting. Julian hurled the box out of the window. It landed with a terrific crash on the crazy paving below. At once the French window there opened, and Uncle Quentin came out like a bullet from a gun.
"Whatever are you doing?" he cried. "What's this on the ground?"
The children looked at the box. It had burst open and lay on the ground, showing a tin lining that was waterproof. Dick ran to pick it up.
"I said, what's this on the ground?" shouted his uncle.
It's something that belongs to us," said Dick, going red.
"Well, I shall take it away from you," said his uncle, "disturbing me like this. Give it to me. Where did you get it?"
Nobody answered.
"Where did you get it?" he barked, glaring at poor Anne, who was nearest.
Out of the wreck," stammered the little girl.
"Out of the wreck?" said her uncle in surprise. "The old wreck that was thrown up yesterday? I heard about that. Do you mean to say that you've been in it?"
"Yes,"
said Dick. "Well, this box may contain something important," he said, and he took it from Dick's hands. "You've no right to go prying about in that old wreck."
"Well, it's my wreck," said George in a defiant tone. "Please, Father, let us have the box. We just got it opened. We thought it might hold
Well, a gold bar or something like that. A gold bar, said her father with a snort. Without another word, he turned and went into the house, carrying the box, burst open and cracked, its tin lining showing through under his arm. Anne burst into tears. "Don't blame me for telling him we got it from the wreck," she sobbed. "Please don't. He glared at me so. I just had to tell him." "All right, Anne," said Julian, putting his arm around her. He thought it was very unfair of his uncle to take the box like that. "Listen, I'm not going to stand this. We'll get hold of that box somehow and look inside it. I'm sure your father won't bother himself with it, George. He'll start writing his book again and forget all about it. I'll wait my chance and slip into his study and get it, even if it means a spanking if I'm discovered." So they took it in turns to keep watch. But most annoyingly, their Uncle Quentin remained in his study all the morning. "Doesn't your father ever go out?" Julian said to George when it was her turn to keep watch. "I don't think he leads a very healthy life." "Scientists never do," said George, as if she knew all about them. Julian was left behind in the garden that afternoon. He sat down under a tree and opened a book. Soon he heard a curious noise that made him look up. He knew at once what it was. "That's Uncle Quentin snoring," he said in excitement. He stole to the French windows. One was a little way open, and Julian opened it a little more. He saw his uncle lying back in a comfortable armchair, his mouth open, his eyes closed, fast asleep. "Well, he really does look sound asleep," thought the boy. "And there's the box, just behind him on that table." He stole in. His uncle still snored. He tiptoed by him to the table behind his chair. He took hold of the box. And then a bit of the broken wood of the box fell to the floor with a thud. His uncle stirred in his chair and opened his eyes. Quick as lightning, the boy crouched down behind the chair, hardly breathing. "What's that?" he heard his uncle say. Julian didn't move. Then his uncle settled down again and shut his eyes. Soon there was the sound of his rhythmic snoring. "Hooray!" thought Julian. "He's off again." On tiptoe, he crept to the French window. He slipped out and ran softly down the garden path. He ran to the beach where the others were lying in the sun. They all sat up with a jerk, thrilled to see the box in his arms. Julian dropped down onto the sand and grinned. "Your father went to sleep," he said to George. "Oh, Tim, don't lick me like that. Now, let's see what's in here. I don't believe your father's even tried to see." The tin lining was intact. It had rusted in the years of lying in the water, and the lid was so tightly fitted down that it was almost impossible to move it. But once George began to work on it with her pocket knife, scraping away the rust, it began to loosen, and in about a quarter of an hour it came off. The children bent eagerly over the box. Inside lay some old papers and a book of some kind with a black cover. Nothing else at all. No bar of gold, no treasure. Everyone felt a little bit disappointed. "It's all quite dry," said Julian. "Not a bit damp. The tin lining kept everything perfect." He picked up the book and opened it. "It's a diary your great-great-great-grandfather kept of the ship's voyages," he said. "I can hardly read the writing, it's so small and funny." George picked up one of the papers. It was made of thick parchment, quite yellow with age. She spread it out onto the sand and looked at it. It seemed to be a kind of map. "Perhaps it's a map of some place he had to go to," said Julian. But suddenly, George's hands began to shake as she held the map, and her eyes gleamed brilliantly as she looked up at the others. "Julian, do you know what this is? It's a map of my old castle, of Kirin Castle, when it wasn't a ruin. And it shows the dungeons, and look, just look what's written in this corner of the dungeons." The others leaned over to see what it was, and printed in old-fashioned letters was a curious word, ingots. "Ingots?" said Anne. "I've never heard that word before." "Ingots!" cried Dick. "Why, bars of gold! They were called ingots." George nodded. She was trembling all over with excitement. "If only we could find it," she whispered. "If only we could." "We'll have a jolly good hunt for it," said Julian.
It will be awfully difficult because the castle is in ruins now and so overgrown. But somehow or other, we'll find those ingots."
Then he looked at the others and frowned.
"What are we going to do about the box?" he said. "I mean, George's father will be sure to miss it, won't he? We'll have to give it back." "Let's take a copy of the map," said Dick. "Then we can put the real map back and replace the box."
They went back to Kieran Cottage and traced out the map carefully. They did it in the tool shed because they didn't want anyone to see them. It was in 3 parts.
"This part shows the dungeons under the castle," said Julian. "And this shows a plan of the ground floor of the castle. And this shows the top part. My word, it was a fine place in those days. The dungeons run all under the castle. I wonder how people got down to them." "We'll have to study the map a bit more and see," said George. "It all looks rather muddled to us at present, but once we take the map over to the castle and study it there, we may be able to make out how to get down to the dungeons."
Julian put the traced map carefully into his jeans pocket. Then he put the real map back into the box and looked towards the house.
"What about putting it back now?" he said. "Maybe your father's still asleep, George."
But he wasn't. He was awake. Luckily, he hadn't missed the box. He came into the dining room to have tea with the family, and Julian took his chance. He slipped away from the table and replaced the box on the table behind his uncle's chair. He winked at the others when he came back. They felt relieved. They were all scared of Uncle Quentin and were not at all anxious to be in his bad books. While they were at tea, the telephone rang, and Aunt Fanny went to answer it. She soon came back.
"It's for you, Quentin," she said. "Apparently the old wreck has caused quite a lot of excitement, and there are men from a London paper who want to ask you questions about it."
The children looked at one another in alarm. They hoped that their uncle wouldn't show the box to the newspaper men. The secret of the hidden gold might come out. The next morning, the papers were full of the extraordinary way in which the old wreck had been thrown up out of the sea. The children were astonished at the interest which it caused. Kirin Island became an object of great interest too. Sightseers from places all round came to see it, and the fishermen managed to find the little inlet and land the people there. George sobbed with rage, and Julian tried to comfort her.
"Listen, George, no one knows our secret yet. We'll wait till the excitement has died down, and then we'll go to Kirin Castle and find the ingots." "If someone doesn't find them first," said George, drying her eyes. She was furious with herself for crying, but she really couldn't help it.
"How could they?" said Julian.
"No one has seen inside the box yet. I'm going to wait my chance and get that map out before anyone sees it."
But he didn't have a chance, because something dreadful happened. Uncle Quentin sold the old box to a man who bought antique things. He came out of his study beaming a day or 2 after the excitement began.
"I've struck a very good bargain with that man," he said to his wife. "You know that old tin-lined box from the wreck? Well, this fellow collects curious things like that and gave me a very good price for it. Very good indeed. More than ever I could expect for the writing of my book. As soon as he saw the old map there and the old diary, he said at once that he'd buy the whole collection."
The children stared at him in horror.
The box was sold. Now someone would study that map and perhaps realize what ingots meant.
When they were alone, the children discussed the whole matter.
"Now listen," said Julian at last. "We'll ask Aunt Fanny if we can go to Kirin Island and spend a day or 2 there. Sleep the night there too, I mean. That will give us a little time to poke round and see what we can find. The sightseers won't come after a day or 2, I'm sure. Maybe we'll get in before anyone tumbles to our secret. After all, the man who bought the box may not even guess that the map shows Kirin Castle."
When they went to ask Aunt Fanny, Uncle Quentin was with her. He was all smiles and even clapped Julian on the back.
"Well," he said, "what's this deputation for?" "We just wanted to ask Aunt Fanny something," said Julian politely. "Aunt Fanny, as the weather is so fine, do you think you would let us go for the weekend to Kirin Castle, please, and spend a day or 2 there on the island? You can't think how we'd love to."
"Well, what do you think, Quentin?" asked their aunt.
"If they want to, they can," said Uncle Quentin.
They won't have a chance to soon. My dears, we've had a marvellous offer for Kirin Island. A man wants to buy it, rebuild the castle as a hotel, and make it into a proper holiday place.
All 4 children stared at him, shocked and horrified. George gave a curious choke. Her eyes burned as if they were on fire. Mother, you can't sell my island. You can't sell my castle. I won't let them be sold.
Her father frowned. Don't be silly, Georgina, he said. It isn't really yours, you know that. It belongs to your mother, and naturally she would like to sell it if she could. We need the money very badly. You'll be able to have a great many nice things once we sell the island.
I don't want nice things, cried George. My castle and my island are the nicest things I could ever have. Mother, you know you said I could have them. You know you did. I believed you. George, dear, I did mean you to have them, said her mother, looking distressed. But now things are different. Your father has been offered quite a good sum, far more than we ever thought of getting, and we really can't afford to turn it down. So, you only gave me the island when you thought it wasn't worth anything, said George, her face white and angry. As soon as it's worth money, you take it away again. I think that's horrid. It isn't honourable.
That's enough, Georgina, said her father angrily. Your mother is guided by me. You're only a child. Your mother didn't really mean what she said. It was only to please you. But you know well enough that you will share in the money we get and have anything you want.
I won't touch a penny, said George in a low, choking voice. You'll be sorry you sold it.
The girl turned and stumbled out of the room. The others felt very sorry for her. They knew what she was feeling. She took things so very seriously. Julian thought she didn't understand grown-ups very well. It wasn't a bit of good fighting grown-ups.
When are you selling the island, Uncle? He asked quietly.
The deeds will be signed in about a week's time, was the answer. So, if you really want to spend a day or 2 there, you better do it quickly.
Was it the man who bought the old box who wants to buy the island? Asked Julian.
Yes, said his uncle. I was a bit surprised, for I thought he was just a buyer of old things. It was astonishing to me that he should get the idea of buying the island. Still, I should think he knows what he's doing.
Yes, he certainly does, thought Julian as he went out of the room with Dick and Anne. He's read that map and has jumped to the same idea that we did. The store of hidden ingots is somewhere on that island, and he's going to get it. He doesn't want to build a hotel. He's after the treasure. He went to find George. She was in the tool shed, looking quite green. She said she felt sick. Listen, George, said Julian. We mustn't give up hope. We'll go to Kirin Island tomorrow, and we'll do our very, very best to get down into the dungeons somehow and find the ingots. We'll jolly well stay there till we do. See? Now cheer up, because we'll want your help in planning everything. Thank goodness we took a tracing of the map. George cheered up a little. The thought of going to Kirin Island for a day or 2 certainly seemed rather good. I do think my father and mother are unkind, she said. Well, they're not really, said Julian wisely. After all, they need money badly, and you know, your father did say you could have anything you want. I know what I'd ask for if I were you. What? Timothy, of course, said Julian, and that made George smile and cheer up tremendously. Julian and George went to find Dick and Anne. They were waiting for them in the garden, looking rather upset. They ran to meet them. Anne took George's hand. I'm awfully sorry about your island, George, she said. So am I, said Dick. Bad luck, old girl. Old boy. George managed to smile. I've been behaving like a girl, she said, but I did get an awful shock. Julian told the others what they'd planned. We'll go tomorrow morning, he said. We'll make out a list of all the things we shall need. Let's begin now. He took out a pencil and notebook. Things to eat, said Dick at once. Something to drink, said George. There's no water on the island, though I believe there was a well or something years ago that went right down below the level of the sea and was fresh water. Anyway, I've never found it. Food, wrote down Julian, and drink. He looked at the others. Spades, he said, and scribbled the word down.
Anne stared. "What for?" she asked. "Well, we want to dig about when we're hunting for the way down to the dungeons." "Ropes," said Dick. "And torches," said George. "It'll be dark in the dungeons." "Ooh," said Anne, feeling a shiver go down her back at the thought. She had no idea what dungeons were like, but they sounded thrilling. "Ooh, rugs," said Dick. At the end of half an hour, they had quite a long list, and everyone felt pleased and excited. George was beginning to recover from her rage and disappointment. If she'd been alone and had brooded, she would have been in an even worse temper. But somehow the others were so calm and cheerful. It was impossible to sulk for long if she was with them. "I think I'd have been much nicer if I hadn't been on my own so much," she thought to herself, as she looked at Julian's bent head. "Talking about things to other people does help a lot. They don't seem so dreadful then. They seem more bearable. I like my cousins because they talk and laugh and they're always cheerful and kind. I'm sulky and bad-tempered, and no wonder Father doesn't like me and scolds me so often. Mother's a dear, but I understand now why she says I'm difficult. I'm different from my cousins. They're easy to understand, and everyone likes them. Oh, I'm glad they came. They're making me more like I ought to be." Julian looked up and caught her blue eyes fixed on him. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. "They're not worth a penny," said George, going red. "Let's go and take Timothy for a walk. He'll be wondering what's happened to us today." Timothy greeted them at the top of his voice. They told him all about their plans for the next day, and he wagged his tail and looked up at them out of his soft brown eyes as if he understood every single word they said. "He must feel pleased to think he's going to be with us for 2 or 3 days," said Anne. It was very exciting the next morning, setting off in the boat with all their things packed neatly at one end. It didn't seem as if they'd forgotten anything. "Got the map?" said Dick suddenly. Julian nodded. "I put on clean jeans this morning," he said, "but I remembered to pop the map into my pocket. Here it is." He took it out, and the wind at once blew it right out of his hand. It fell into the sea. All 4 children gave a cry of utter dismay. "Quick, we must row after it," cried George, and swung the boat round. But someone was quicker than she was. Tim had seen the paper fly from Julian's hand, and had heard and understood the cries. With an enormous splash, he leapt into the water and swam after the map. He could swim well, for he was strong and powerful. He soon had the map in his mouth and was swimming back to the boat. George hauled him in and took the map from him. There was hardly the mark of his teeth, he'd carried it so carefully. It was wet, and the children looked anxiously at it to see if the tracing had been spoilt. But Julian had traced it very strongly, and it was quite all right. He placed it on the seat to dry and told Dick to hold it there in the sun. "Whew, that was a narrow squeak," he said, and the others agreed. George took the oars again, and they set off once more for the island, getting a perfect shower bath from Timothy when he stood up and shook his wet coat. The children thought he was a hero. He was given a big biscuit and crunched it up with great enjoyment. George made her way through the reefs of rock with a sure hand. It was marvellous to the others how she could slide the boat in between the rocks and never get a scratch. She brought them safely to the little inlet, and they jumped out onto the sand. They pulled the boat high up and then began to unload their goods. "We'll carry the things to that little stone room," said Julian. "They'll be safe there and won't get wet if it rains. Oh, I hope nobody comes to the island while we're here, George." "I shouldn't think they would," said George. "Father said it would be about a week before the deeds were signed, making over the island to that man. It won't be his till then. We've got a week anyhow." "Well, we don't need to keep watch in case anyone else arrives then," said Julian. "Come on, you take the spades, Dick. I'll take the food and drink with George, and Anne can take the little things." The food and drink were in a big box. They had brought loaves of bread, butter, biscuits, jam, tins of fruit, ripe plums, bottles of ginger beer, a kettle to make tea, and anything else they could think of. George and Julian staggered up the cliff with the heavy box. They had to put it down twice to give themselves a rest. They put everything into the little room. Then they went back to get the collection of rugs and blankets from the boat. They arranged them in the corners of the little room.
"The 2 girls can sleep together on this pile of rugs," said Julian, "and we 2 boys will have this pile."
George looked as if she didn't want to be put with Anne and classed as a girl. But Anne didn't wish to sleep alone in her corner, and she looked so beseechingly at George that the bigger girl smiled at her and made no objection.
"Well, now we'll get down to business," said Julian, and pulled out the map. "We must study this really carefully and find out exactly under what spot the entrances to the dungeons are."
They all bent over the map. It was quite dry now, and the children looked at it earnestly.
"Now, look," said Julian, putting a finger on the plan of the dungeons. "These seem to run all along under the castle. Here and here are the marks that seem to be meant to represent steps or stairs that lead down to them." "Yes," said George, "I should think they are. Well, if so, there appear to be 2 ways of getting into the dungeons. One lot of steps seems to begin somewhere near this little room, and the other seems to start under the tower there. And what do you suppose this thing is here, Julian?"
She put her finger on a round hole that was shown not only in the plan of the dungeons, but also in the plan of the ground floor of the castle.
"Can't imagine what that is," said Julian.
"Oh, yes. I know what it might be. You said there was an old well somewhere, do you remember? Well, that may be it, I should think. It would have to be very deep to get fresh water right under the sea, so it probably goes down through the dungeons too."
They looked at one another.
"Well," said Dick, "what are we going to start on? Shall we try to find the entrance to the dungeons that seems to start round about this little room? For all we know, there may be a big stone we can lift that opens above the dungeon steps."
Julian folded up the precious map and put it into his pocket. He looked round. The stone floor of the little room was overgrown with creeping weeds.
"Well, we'd better set to work," he said, and he picked up a spade. "Let's clear away these weeds with our spades, scrape them off, look, like this, and then examine every single stone."
Soon the little stone room was full of a scraping sound as the 4 of them chiselled away at the close-growing weeds with their spades. It wasn't very difficult to get the stones clear of them, and the children worked with a will. Tim joined in valiantly. He scraped away at the floor with his 4 paws, sending earth and plants flying high into the air.
"Hey, Tim," said Julian, shaking a clod of earth out of his hair. "You're being a bit too vigorous. My word, you'll send the stones flying into the air too in a minute." "George, isn't Tim marvellous the way he joins in everything?"
Soon the stones of the little room were clear of earth, sand and weeds. The children saw that they were all the same size, big and square, fitted well together.
"We should probably find one with an iron ring handle sunk into it," said Julian.
But they didn't. All the stones looked exactly the same. Julian tried inserting his spade into the cracks between the various stones to see if by any chance he could move one. But they couldn't be moved. It seemed as if they were all set into the solid ground. After about 3 hours' hard work, the children sat down to eat a meal. They were very hungry indeed. As they ate, they discussed the problems they were trying to solve.
"It looks as if the entrance to the dungeons was not under this little room after all," said Julian. "It's disappointing. Let's measure the map and see if we can make out exactly where the steps do start."
So they measured as best they could, but it was impossible to tell, for the plans of the 3 floors seemed to be done to different scales. It seemed rather hopeless.
"Look," said George, suddenly putting her finger on the hole that they thought could be meant to represent a well. "The entrance to the dungeons seems to be not very far off the well. If only we could find the well, we could hunt around a bit for the beginning of the dungeon steps. The well is shown in both maps. It seems to be somewhere about the middle of the castle."
Out they went into the sunshine. They stood in the ruined courtyard that had once been the centre of the castle. They paced out the middle of the yard and then stood there, looking around for anything that might perhaps have been the opening of an old well. It was all so overgrown. Sand had been blown in from the shore, and weeds and bushes of all kinds grew there.
"Look, there's a rabbit," cried Dick,
as a big sandy rabbit lolloped slowly across the yard. It disappeared into a hole on the other side.
Then another rabbit appeared, sat up and looked at the children, and then vanished too. A third rabbit appeared. It was a small one with absurdly big ears and the tiniest white bob of a tail. It didn't even look at the children. It bounded about and then sat up on its hind legs and began to wash its ears, pulling down first one and then the other. This was too much for Timothy. He had watched the other two bound across the yard and then disappear without so much as barking at them. But to see this youngster actually sitting there, washing its ears under his very nose, was really too much for any dog. He gave a yelp and rushed full tilt at the surprised rabbit. For a moment the little thing didn't move. It had never been frightened or chased before, and it stared with big eyes at the rushing dog. Then it turned itself about and tore off at full speed, its white bobtail going up and down. It disappeared under a gorse bush near the children. Timothy went after it, vanishing under the big bush too. Then a shower of sand and earth was thrown up as Tim tried to go down the hole after the rabbit and scraped and scrabbled with his strong front paws as fast as he could.
"Tim, come out of there," shouted George. "You're not to chase the rabbits here. You know you mustn't. You're very naughty. Come out."
But Tim didn't come out. He just went on and on, scraping madly. George went to fetch him. Just as she got to the gorse bush, the scraping suddenly stopped. There came a yelp, and no more noise was heard. George peered under the prickly bush in astonishment. Tim had disappeared. He just simply wasn't there anymore. There was the big rabbit hole, made enormous by Tim, but there was no Tim.
"I say, Julian, Tim's gone," said George in a scared voice. "He surely can't have gone down that rabbit's hole, can he? I mean, he's such a big dog."
The children crowded round the big gorse bush. There came the sound of a muffled whine from somewhere below it. Julian looked astonished.
"He is down the hole," he said. "However are we going to get him out?" "We'll have to dig up the gorse bush to begin with," said George in a determined voice. She would have dug up the whole of Kirin Island to get Tim back, that was certain. The bush was far too big and prickly to creep underneath. Julian was glad that they'd brought tools of all kinds. He went to fetch an axe. Soon the poor bush began to look a sorry sight. But it took a long time to destroy it, for it was prickly, sturdy and stout. Every child's hands were scratched by the time it had been reduced to a mere stump. Then they could see the hole quite well. Julian shone his torch down it. He gave a shout of surprise. "I know what's happened. The old well is here. The rabbits had a hole at the side of it. Tim scraped away to make it bigger and uncovered a bit of the well hole, and he's fallen down the well." A distant whine came to their ears. The children looked at one another. "There's only one thing to do," said Julian. "We must get our spades and dig out the hole of the well. Then maybe we can let a rope down or something and get Tim." They set to work with their spades. It was not really difficult to uncover the hole, which had been blocked only by the spreading roots of the big gorse bush, some fallen masonry, earth, sand and small stones. Apparently a big slab had fallen from part of the tower across the well hole and partly closed it. The weather and the growing gorse bush had done the rest. It took all the children together to move the slab. Underneath was a very rotten wooden cover, which had plainly been used in the old days to protect the well. When Tim's weight had pressed on it, it had given way and made a hole for him to fall through. Julian removed the wooden cover, and then the children could see down the well hole. It was very deep and very dark. They couldn't possibly see the bottom. Julian shone his torch down, and there was Tim. Many years before, a big slab had fallen down the well itself and had stuck a little way down across the well hole, and on this cracked old slab sat Tim, his big eyes staring up in fright. He simply could not imagine what had happened to him. There was an old iron ladder fastened to the side of the well. George was on it before anyone else could get there. Down she went, not caring if the ladder held or not, and reached Tim. Somehow she got him onto her shoulder, and holding him there with one hand, she climbed slowly up again. The other three hauled her out, and Tim jumped round her,
barking and licking for all he was worth. "Well, Tim," said Dick, "you shouldn't chase rabbits, but you've certainly done us a good turn, because you found the well. Now we've only got to look around a little to find the dungeon entrance." They set to work again to hunt for the entrance. They dug about with their spades under all the bushes. They pulled up crooked stones and dug their spades into the earth below, hoping that they might suddenly find them going through into space. And then Anne found it, quite by accident. She was tired and sat down to rest. She lay on her front and scrabbled about in the sand. Suddenly, her fingers touched something hard and cold in the sand. She uncovered it, and lo and behold, it was an iron ring. "There's a stone with an iron ring in it here," yelled Anne. They all rushed over to her. Julian dug about with his spade and uncovered the whole stone. Sure enough, it did have a ring in it, and rings are only let into stones that need to be moved. All the children took turns at pulling on the iron ring, but the stone did not move. Then Julian tied 2 or 3 turns of rope through it, and the 4 children put out their full strength and pulled for all they were worth. The stone moved. The children distinctly felt it stir. "All together again," cried Julian, and all together they pulled. The stone stirred again, and then suddenly gave way. It rose upwards, and the children fell over on top of one another, like a row of dominoes suddenly pushed down. Julian and George shot to their feet and rushed to the opening. A steep flight of steps cut out of the rock itself led downwards into deep darkness. "Come on," cried Julian, snapping on his torch. The steps were slippery. Tim darted down first, lost his foothold and rolled down 5 or 6 steps, yelping with fright. Julian went after him, then George, then Dick, and then Anne. It was dark and smelt very musty. Anne choked a little. "I hope the air down here is all right," said Julian. "If anyone feels a bit funny, they'd better say so and we'll go up into the open air again." But however funny they might feel, nobody would have said so. The steps went down a long way. Then they came to an end. Julian stepped down from the last stair and flashed his torch around. It was a weird sight that met his eyes. The dungeons in Kirin Castle were made out of the rock itself. Whether there were natural caves there, or whether they'd been hollowed out by man, the children couldn't tell. But certainly they were dark and full of echoing sounds. When Julian gave a sigh of excitement, it fled into the rocky hollows and swelled out and echoed around as if it were a live thing. "Isn't it strange?" said George in a low voice. At once the echoes took up her words and multiplied them and made them louder. "Isn't it strange? Isn't it strange? Isn't it strange?" Anne slipped her hand into Dick's. She felt scared. "Where do you suppose the ingots are?" said Dick, and at once the caves threw him back his words. "Ingots, ingots are, are." "Come on," said Julian. "Maybe the echoes won't be so bad a little farther in." "Farther in," said the echoes at once. "Farther in." They moved away from the steps and explored the rocky cellars stretching under the castle. "I wonder which dungeon was used for storing the ingots," said Julian. He stopped and took the map out of his pocket. He flashed his torch on it. But although it showed him quite plainly the dungeon where ingots were marked, he had no idea at all of the right direction. "I say, look, there's a door here shutting off the next dungeon," suddenly cried Dick. "I bet this is the one we're looking for." 4 torches were flashed onto the wooden door. It was big and stout, studded with great iron nails. Julian gave a whoop of delight and rushed to it. But the door was shut fast. No amount of pushing or pulling would open it. It had a great keyhole, but no key. "We'll fetch the axe," said Julian. "We may be able to chop round the keyhole and smash the lock." They left the big door and tried to get back the way they'd come. But the dungeons were so big and so rambling that they lost their way. They stumbled over old broken barrels, rotting wood, empty bottles, and many other things as they tried to find their way back to the flight of rock steps. "Oh, this is sickening," said Julian at last. "I simply haven't any idea at all where the entrance is. We keep on going into one dungeon after another, and one passage after another, and they all seem to be exactly the same. Dark and smelly and mysterious. Suppose we have to stay here all the rest of our lives, said Anne, gloomily. Idiot, said Dick, taking her hand. We shall soon find the way out. Hello? What's this? They all stopped. They had come to what looked like a chimney shaft of brick, stretching down from the roof of the dungeon to the floor. Julian flashed his torch onto it. I know what it is, said George suddenly. It's the well, of course. You remember, it was shown in the plan of the dungeons, as well as the plan of the ground floor. That's the shaft of the well going down and down. I wonder if there's any opening in it just here, so that water could be taken into the dungeons as well as up to the ground floor. They went to see. On the other side of the well shaft was a small opening, big enough for one child at a time to put his head and shoulders through and look down. They shone their torches down and up. The well was so deep that it was impossible to see the bottom of it. Julian dropped a stone down, but there was no sound of either a thud or a splash. He looked upwards and could see the faint gleam of daylight that slid round the broken slab of stone lying a little way from the top of the shaft, the slab on which Tim had sat, waiting to be rescued. Yes, he said, this is the well, all right. Now we've found the well, we know that the entrance to the dungeons isn't very far off. They took each other's hands and hunted round in the dark, their torches making bright beams of light here and there. Anne gave a screech of excitement. Here's the entrance! It must be, because I can see daylight! Sure enough, there was the steep, rocky flight of steps. They all went up into the sunshine. It was delicious to feel the warmth after the cold air down in the dungeons. Julian looked at his watch. It's 6:30. 6:30? No wonder I feel hungry. We haven't had any tea. We've been working and wandering about those dungeons for hours. Well, let's have a kind of tea supper before we do anything else, said Dick. I feel as if I hadn't had anything to eat for about 12 months. It was fun boiling the kettle on a fire of dry sticks. It was lovely to lie about in the warmth of the evening sun and munch bread and cheese and enjoy cake and biscuits. Tim had a good meal too. He hadn't very much liked being underground and had followed the others very closely indeed, his tail well down. He had been frightened too of the curious echoes. But now he was happy again, eating the titbits that the children gave him and licking George whenever he was near her. It was past 8 o'clock by the time that the children had finished their meal and tied it up. Julian looked at the others. The sun was sinking, and the day was no longer so warm. Well, he said, I don't know what you feel, but I'm tired, and I don't like the thought of losing my way in those dungeons at night. The others heartily agreed with him, especially Anne, who had secretly been dreading going down again with the night coming on. Come on, Anne, said George, pulling her to her feet. Bed for you. We'll cuddle up together in the rugs on the floor of that little room. In the morning, we'll think of opening that door. All 4 children, with Tim close behind, went off to the little stone room. They curled up on their piles of rugs, and Tim crept in with George and Anne. The children slept peacefully until the morning, when Tim saw a rabbit through the broken archway leading to the little room and sped away to chase it. He woke George as he got up from the rugs, and she sat up and rubbed her eyes. Wake up, she cried to the others. Wake up! It's morning, and we're on the island. They had breakfast and ate just as much as ever. Then Julian picked up the axe and took everyone to the flight of steps. Tim went too. They all went underground again. And then they couldn't find the way to the wooden door. It was most tiresome. We shall lose our way all over again, said George. These dungeons are about the most rambling, spread-out maze of underground caves I've ever known. We shall lose the entrance again, too. Julian had a bright idea. He had a piece of white chalk in his pocket, and he took it out. He went back to the steps and marked the wall there. Then he began to put chalk marks along the passages as they walked in the musty darkness. They came to the well, and Julian was pleased. Now, he said, whenever we come to the well, we shall at least be able to find the way back to the steps, because we can follow my chalk marks. Now, the next thing is, which is the way? We'll try and find the door, and I'll put chalk marks along the walls here and there. But if we go the wrong way and have to come back, we'll rub out the marks and start again from the well another way.
This was really a very good idea. They did go the wrong way and had to come back, rubbing out Julian's marks. They got back to the well and set off in the opposite direction. And this time they did find the wooden door. There it was, stout and sturdy, its old iron nails rusty and red. Julian lifted his axe. Crash! He drove it into the wood by the keyhole. But the wood was still strong, and the axe only went in an inch. Julian drove it in once more. The axe hit one of the big nails and slipped a little to one side. A big splinter of wood flew out and struck Dick on the cheek. He gave a yell of pain. Julian jumped in alarm and turned to look at him. Dick's cheek was pouring with blood.
Something flew out of the door and hit me, said Dick. It's a splinter or something.
Golly, said Julian, and he shone his torch onto Dick. Can you bear it if I pull the splinter out? It's a big one, and it's still sticking into your cheek. But Dick pulled it out himself. He made a face with the pain, and then turned very white. You'd better go up into the open air for a bit, said Julian, and we'll have to bathe your cheek and stop it bleeding somehow. Anne's got a clean hanky. We'll bathe it and dab it with that.
I'll go with Dick, said Anne. You stay here with George. There's no need for us all to go.
But Julian thought he'd like to see Dick safely up into the open air first, and then he could leave him with Anne. He handed the axe to George. You can do a bit of chopping while I'm gone, he said. I'll be back in a few minutes. Right, said George, and she took the axe. Leaving George with Tim, Julian took Dick and Anne up to the open air. Anne dipped her hanky into the kettle of water and dabbed Dick's cheek gently. It was bleeding, but the wound was not really very bad. Dick's colour soon came back, and he wanted to go down into the dungeons again. No, you better lie down on your back for a while, said Julian. I know that's good for nose bleeding. Maybe it's good for cheek bleeding too. What about Anne and you going out on the rocks over there, where you can see the wreck, and staying there for half an hour or so? Come on, I'll take you both there and leave you for a bit. You'd better not get up till your cheeks stop bleeding, old boy. Julian took the two out of the castle yard and out onto the rocks on the side of the island that faced the open sea. The dark hulk of the old wreck was still there on the rocks. Dick lay down on his back and stared up into the sky. Anne took his hand. Julian sat down beside them for a minute or two, then he went back to the rocky steps and disappeared down them. He followed his chalk marks and soon came to where George was attacking the door. She had smashed it well round the lock, but it simply would not give way. Julian took the axe from her and drove it hard into the wood. After a blow or two, something seemed to happen to the lock. It became loose and hung a little sideways. Julian put down the axe. I think somehow that we can open the door now, he said in an excited voice. Get out of the way, Tim, old fellow. Now then, push, George. They both pushed, and the lock gave way with a grating noise. The big door opened creakingly, and the two children went inside, flashing their torches. The room was not much more than a cave hollowed out of the rock, but in it was something quite different from the old barrels and boxes the children had found before. At the back, in untidy piles, were curious brick-shaped things of dull, yellow-brown metal. Julian picked one up. George, he cried, the ingots! These are real gold! Oh, I know they don't look like it, but they are all the same. George! Oh, George! There's a fortune here in this cellar, and it's yours! We've found it at last! George couldn't say a word. She just stood there staring at the pile of ingots, holding one in her hands. She could hardly believe that these strange brick-shaped things were really gold. Her heart thumped fast. What a wonderful, marvellous find! Suddenly, Tim began to bark loudly. He stood with his back to the children, his nose towards the door. Shut up, Tim, said Julian. What can you hear? Is it the others coming back? He went to the door and yelled down the passage outside. Dick!
Anne, come quickly, because we've found the ingots. We've found them. Hurry!
Tim stopped barking and began to growl. George looked puzzled.
Whatever can be the matter with him, she said. He surely can't be growling at Dick and Anne.
Then both children got a most tremendous shock, for a man's voice came booming down the dark passage, making echoes all around.
Who's here? Who's down here?
George clutched Julian in fright. Tim went on growling, all the hairs on his neck standing up straight.
Do be quiet, Tim,
whispered George, snapping off her torch. But Tim would not be quiet. He went on growling as if he were a small thunderstorm. The children saw the beam of a powerful torch coming round the corner of the dungeon passage. Then the light picked them out, and the holder of the torch came to a stop. "Well, well, well," said a voice. "Look who's here. 2 children in the dungeons of my castle."
What do you mean, your castle?
cried George. "Well, my dear little girl, it is my castle because I'm in the process of buying it," said the voice. Then another voice spoke, more gruffly. "What are you doing down here? What did you mean when you shouted out Dick and Anne and said you'd found the ingots?"
Don't answer,
whispered Julian to George. But the echoes took his words and made them very loud in the passage.
Don't answer. Don't answer.
"Oh, so you won't answer," said the second man, and he stepped towards the children. Tim bared his teeth, but the man didn't seem at all frightened of him. The man went to the door and flashed his torch inside the dungeon. He gave a long whistle of surprise. "Jake, look here," he said. "You were right. The gold's here all right. And how easy to take away. All in ingots, my word. This is the most amazing thing we've ever struck."
This gold is mine, said George in a fury. The island and the castle belong to my mother, and so does anything found here. This gold was brought here and stored by my great-great-great-grandfather before his ship got wrecked. It's not yours and never will be. As soon as I get back home, I shall tell my father and mother what we found, and then you may be sure you won't be able to buy the castle or the island. Oh, you were very clever, finding out about the gold from the map in the old box, but just not clever enough for us. We found it first.
The men listened in silence to George's clear and angry voice. One of them laughed. "You're only a child," he said. "You surely don't think you can keep us from getting our way. We're going to buy the island and everything in it, and we shall take the gold when the deeds are signed. And if by any chance we couldn't buy the island, we'd take the gold just the same. It'll be easy enough to bring a ship here and transfer the ingots by boat from here to the ship. Don't worry, we shall get what we want all right."
You will not, said George, and she stepped out of the door. I'm going straight home now, and I'll tell my father all you've said.
"My dear little girl, you are not going home," said the first man, putting his hands on George and forcing her back into the dungeon. "And by the way, unless you want me to shoot this unpleasant dog of yours, call him off, will you?" George saw, to her dismay, that the man had a shining revolver in his hand. She caught hold of Tim's collar and pulled him to her.
Be quiet, Tim, she said. It's all right.
But Tim knew quite well that it wasn't all right. Something was very wrong. He went on growling fiercely. "Now, listen to me," said the man, after he had had a hurried talk with his companion. "If you're sensible, nothing unpleasant will happen to you. But if you want to be obstinate, you'll be very sorry. What we're going to do is this. We're going off in our motorboat, leaving you nicely locked up here. And we're going to get a ship and come back for the gold. We don't think it's worthwhile buying the island now we know where the ingots are. And," said the other man, "you are going to write a note to your companions above, telling them you found the gold and that they are to come down and look at it. Then we shall lock up all of you in this dungeon, with the ingots to play with, leaving you food and drink to last you till we come back. Now then, here's a pencil. Write a note to Dick and Anne, whoever they are, and send your dog up with it. Come on."
I won't, said George, her face furious. I won't. You can't make me do a thing like that. I won't get Dick and Anne down here to be made prisoners, and I won't let you have my gold.
"Then your dog will be shot if you don't do as you're told," said the first man suddenly. George's heart sank down and she felt cold and terrified. "No, no," she said in a low, desperate voice. "Well, write the note then," said the man, offering her a pencil and paper. "Go on, I'll tell you what to say."
"I can't," sobbed George. "I don't want to get Dick and Anne down here to be made prisoners."
"All right, I'll shoot the dog then," said the man in a cold voice, and he levelled his revolver at poor Tim. George threw her arms round her dog and screamed,
"No, no, I'll write the note. Don't shoot Tim."
The girl took the paper and pencil in a shaking hand and looked at the man. "Write this," he ordered. "Dear Dick and Anne, we found the gold. Come on down at once and see it. Then sign your name." George wrote what the man had said. Then she signed her name. But instead of writing George, she put Georgina. She knew that the others would feel certain that she would never sign herself that, and she hoped it would warn them something was up. The man took the note and fastened it to Tim's collar. The dog growled all the time, but George kept telling him not to bite. "Now then, tell him to go and find your friends," said the man.
"Find Dick and Anne," commanded George. "Go on, Tim. Find Dick and Anne. Give them the note."
Tim did not want to leave George, but there was something very urgent in her voice. He took one last look at his mistress, gave her hand a lick, and sped off down the passage. He knew the way now. Up the rocky steps he bounded and into the open air. He stopped in the old yard, sniffing. Where were Dick and Anne? He smelt their footsteps and ran off, his nose to the ground. He soon found the two children out on the rocks. Dick was feeling better now and was sitting up. His cheek had almost stopped bleeding. "Hello," he said in surprise when he saw Tim. "Here's Timothy. Tim, old chap, why have you come up to see us? Did you get tired of being underground?" "Look, Dick, he's got something twisted into his collar," said Anne. "It's a note. I expect it's from the others telling us to go down. Isn't Tim clever to bring it?" Dick took the paper from Tim's collar. He undid it and read it. "Dear Dick and Anne," he read out loud, "we found the gold. Come on down at once and see it. Georgina." "Oh," said Anne, her eyes shining. "They found it. Oh, Dick, are you well enough to come now? Let's hurry." But Dick did not get up from the rocks. He sat and stared at the note.
"What's the matter?" said Anne. "Well, don't you think it's funny that George should suddenly sign herself Georgina?" said Dick slowly. "You know how she hates being a girl and having a girl's name. You know how she'll never answer if anyone calls her Georgina. And yet, in this note, she signs herself by the name she hates. It does seem a bit funny to me, almost as if it's a kind of warning that there's something wrong." "Oh, don't be silly, Dick," said Anne. "What could be wrong? Oh, do come on." "Anne, I'd like to pop over to that inlet of ours to make sure there's no one else come to the island," said Dick. "You stay here." But Anne didn't want to stay there alone. She ran round the coast with Dick, telling him all the time that she thought he was very silly. But when they came to the little harbour, they saw that there was another boat there as well as their own. It was the motor boat. "Look," said Dick in a whisper. "There is someone else here. And I bet it's the man who wants to buy the island. I bet they've read that old map and know there's gold here. And they've found George and Julian and want to get us all together down in the dungeons so that they can keep us safe till they've stolen the gold. They made George send us that note, but she signed it with a name she never uses to warn us. Now, we must think hard. What are we going to do?" Dick caught hold of Anne's hand and pulled her quickly away from the cove. He was afraid that whoever had come to the island might be somewhere about and see them. The boy took Anne to the little stone room where their things were, and they sat down in a corner. "Whoever has come has discovered Julian and George smashing in that door, I should think," said Dick in a whisper. "I just can't think what to do. We mustn't go down into the dungeons, or we'll certainly be caught. Hello? Where's Tim off to?"
The dog had kept with them for a while, but now he ran off to the entrance of the dungeons. He disappeared down the steps. He meant to get back to George, for he knew she was in danger. Dick and Anne stared after him. They had felt comforted while he was there, and now they were sorry that he was gone. Then Anne had an idea.
"I know," she said. "We'll row back to the land in our boat and get help."
"I'd thought of that," said Dick gloomily. "But you know we'd never find the way in and out of those rocks. We'd wreck the boat, and I'm sure we're not strong enough to row all the way back. Oh, dear. I do wish we could think what to do." They didn't need to puzzle their brains long. The men came up out of the dungeons and began to hunt for the two children. They had seen Tim when he came back and had found the note gone. So they knew the two children had taken it, and they couldn't imagine why they hadn't obeyed what George had said in the note and come down to the dungeons. Dick heard their voices. He clutched hold of Anne to make her keep quiet. He saw through the broken archway that the men were going in the opposite direction.
"Anne, I know where we can hide," said the boy excitedly. "Down the old well. We can climb down the ladder a little way and hide there. I'm sure no one would ever look there."
Anne didn't at all want to climb down the well even a little way, but Dick pulled her to her feet and hurried her off to the middle of the old courtyard. The men were hunting around the other side of the castle. There was just time to climb in. Dick slid aside the old wooden cover of the well and helped Anne down the ladder. She was very scared. Then the boy climbed down himself and slid the cover back again over his head as best he could. The old stone slab that Tim had sat on when he fell down the well was still there. Dick climbed down to it and tested it. It was immovable.
"It's safe for you to sit on, Anne, if you don't want to keep clinging to the ladder," he whispered.
So Anne sat shivering on the stone slab across the well shaft, waiting to see if they were discovered or not. They kept hearing the voices of the men, now near at hand and now far off. Then the men began to shout for them.
"Dick! Anne! The others want you! Where are you? We've got exciting news for you!"
"Well, why don't they let Julian and George come up and tell us then?" whispered Dick. "There's something wrong. I know there is."
The two men came into the courtyard. They were angry.
"Where have those kids got to?" said Jake. "Their boat's still in the cove, so they haven't got away. They must be hiding somewhere. We can't wait all day for them." "Well, let's take some food and drink down to the two we've locked up," said the other man. "There's plenty in that little stone room. I suppose it's a store the children brought over. We'll leave half in the room so that the other two kids can have it, and we'll take their boat with us so they can't escape." "Right," said Jake. "The thing to do is to get the gold away as quickly as possible and make sure the children are prisoners here until we've made a safe getaway. We won't bother any more about trying to buy the island. After all, it was only the thought of getting the ingots that put us up to the idea." "Well, come on," said his companion. "We'll take the food down now and not bother about the other kids. You stay here and see if you can spot them while I go down."
Dick and Anne hardly dared to breathe when they heard all this. They heard one man walk to the little stone room. It was plain that he was getting food and drink to take down to the two prisoners in the dungeons below. The other man stayed in the courtyard, whistling softly. After what seemed a very long time, the first man came back. Then the two went off to the cove. Dick heard the motorboat being started up.
"It's safe to get out now, Anne," he said.
They climbed out and stood warming themselves in the sunshine. They could see the motorboat streaking towards the mainland.
"Well, they've gone for the moment," said Dick, "and they've not taken our boat as they said they would. If only we could rescue Julian and George, we could get help." "Well, why can't we rescue them?" cried Anne, her eyes shining. "We can go down the steps and unbolt the door, can't we?"
"No, we can't," said Dick.
"Look."
Anne looked where he pointed. She saw big, heavy slabs of stone piled over the dungeon entrance. The two men had put them there. It had taken all their strength. Neither Dick nor Anne could hope to move them.
"It's quite impossible to get down the steps," said Dick. "They've made sure we don't do that. And you know, we haven't any idea where the second entrance is. We only know it was somewhere near the tower." "Well, let's see if we can find it," said Anne eagerly.
They set off for the tower, but it was quite clear that whatever entrance there might have been once, it was gone now. There were piles of old broken stones everywhere, which were quite impossible to move. The children soon gave up the search. Anne sat down on a stone and thought hard. She was very worried. And then she brightened up a little and turned to Dick.
Dick, I suppose we couldn't possibly climb down the well, could we? She asked. You know it goes past the dungeons, and there's an opening in the well shaft on the dungeon floor because, don't you remember, we were able to put in our heads and shoulders and look right up the well to the top? Could we get past that slab, the one that I sat on just now, that has fallen across the shaft?
Dick thought it all over. He went to the well and peered down it.
You know, I believe you're right, Anne, he said at last. We might be able to squeeze past that slab. There's just about room. I don't know how far the iron ladder goes down, though. Oh, Dick, do let's try, said Anne. It's our only chance of rescuing the others.
Well, said Dick, I'll try it, but not you, Anne. I'm not going to have you falling down that well. The ladder might be broken halfway down. Anything might happen. You must stay up here, and I'll see what I can do.
You will be careful, won't you, said Anne. Take a rope with you, Dick.
Good idea, said Dick. He went to the little stone room and got one of the ropes they'd put there. He wound it round and round his waist, and then he went back to Anne.
Well, here goes, he said.
Anne was white. She was terribly afraid that Dick might fall right down to the bottom of the well. She watched him climb down the iron ladder to the slab of stone. He tried his best to squeeze by it, but it was very difficult. At last he managed it, and after that Anne could see him no more, but she could hear him, for he kept calling up to her.
Ladder's still going strong, Anne. I'm all right. Can you hear me?
Yes,
shouted Anne down the well, hearing her voice echo.
Take care, Dick. I do hope the ladder goes all the way down. I think it does,
yelled back Dick. And then he gave a loud exclamation.
Blow! It's broken just here. Broken right off. I'll have to use my rope.
There was a silence as Dick unwound the rope from his waist. He tied it firmly to the last but one rung of the ladder, which seemed quite strong.
I'm going down the rope now, he shouted. Don't worry, I'm all right. Here I go.
Dick slid down the rope, holding onto it with hands, knees and feet. He wondered if he was anywhere near the dungeons. He seemed to have gone a long way. He managed to get out his torch. He put it between his teeth after he'd switched it on, so that he might have both hands free for the rope. The light from the torch showed him the walls of the well around him. He couldn't make out if he was above or below the dungeons. He didn't want to go right down to the bottom of the well. He decided that he must have passed the opening into the dungeon caves. He climbed back up the rope a little way, and to his delight saw that he was right. The opening was just by his head. He climbed up till he was level with it, and then swung himself to the side of the well where the opening was. He managed to get hold of the bricked edge, and then tried to scramble through into the dungeon. It was difficult, but luckily Dick was not very big. He managed it at last and stood up straight with a sigh of relief. He could now follow the chalk marks to the dungeon where the ingots were, and where he felt sure that George and Julian were imprisoned. He shone his torch on the wall. Yes, there were the chalk marks. He put his head into the well opening and yelled at the top of his voice,
Anne, I'm in the dungeons. Watch out that the men don't come back.
Then he began to follow the white chalk marks, his heart beating fast. After a while, he came to the door. As he expected, it was fastened. Big bolts had been driven home at the top and bottom, and the children inside the room could not possibly get out. They had tried their hardest to batter down the door, but it was no good at all. They were now sitting down, feeling angry and exhausted. The man had brought them food and drink, but they'd not touched it. Tim was with them, lying down with his head on his paws,
half angry with George because she had not let him fly at the men as he'd so badly wanted to. But George felt certain that Tim would have been shot if he'd tried biting or snapping.
Anyway, the other two had sense enough not to come down, said George. They must have known there was something funny about that note when they saw that I'd signed myself Georgina. I wonder what they're doing. They must be hiding.
Tim suddenly gave a growl. He leapt to his feet and went to the door, his head on one side. He had heard something, that was certain.
I hope it's not those men back again already, said George.
A great bang on the door made them all jump out of their skins, and then came Dick's cheerful voice.
"Hi, Julian. Hi, George. Are you here?"
"Ruff!" barked Tim joyfully.
"Dick, open the door!"
yelled Julian in delight. Dick unbolted the door at the top and the bottom and flung it open. He rushed in and thumped George and Julian happily on the back. "How does it feel to be rescued?" he said. "Fine," cried Julian, and Tim barked madly round them. George grinned at Dick. "Good work," she said. "What happened?" Dick told them. When he described how he'd climbed down the old well, George and Julian could hardly believe their ears. Julian slipped his arm through his younger brother's. "You're a brick," he said. "A real brick. Now, quick, what are we going to do?" "Well, if they've left us our boat, I'm going to take us all back to the mainland as quick as possible," said George. "I'm not playing about with men who brandish revolvers. Come on, up the well we go." They ran to the well shaft and squeezed through the small opening one by one. Up the rope they went and soon found the iron ladder. Julian made them go up one by one in case the old ladder wouldn't bear the weight of all three at once. It really wasn't very long before they were up in the open air once more, giving Anne hugs and hearing her exclaim with tears in her eyes how pleased she was to see them all again. "Now come on," said George. "Off to the boat, quick. Those men may be back at any time." They rushed to the cove, and there was their boat lying where they'd pulled it, out of reach of the waves. But what a shock awaited them. "They've taken the oars," said George in dismay. "The beasts! They know we can't row the boat without oars. They were afraid you and Anne might row off, Dick, so instead of bothering to tow the boat behind them, they just grabbed the oars. Oh, now we're stuck." It was a great disappointment. After Dick's rescue, it had seemed as if everything was going right, and now, suddenly, things were going wrong again. "We must think this out," said Julian, sitting down where he could see at once if any boat came in sight. "The men have gone off, probably to get a ship from somewhere in which they can put the ingots and sail away. They won't be back for some time, I should think, because you can't charter a ship all in a hurry, unless, of course, they've got one of their own. And in the meantime, we can't get off the island to get help because they've got our oars," said George. "We can't even signal to any passing fishing boat because they won't be out just now, the tide's wrong. It seems as if all we can do is wait here till the men come and take my gold, and we can't stop them." "You know, I've got a sort of plan coming into my head," said Julian slowly. "Wait a bit. Don't interrupt me. I'm thinking." The others waited in silence while Julian sat and frowned. Then he looked at them and smiled. "I believe it will work," he said. "Listen. We'll wait here till the men come back. What will they do? They'll drag away those stones blocking the top of the dungeon entrance and go down the steps. They'll go to the dungeon where they left us, thinking we're still there, and they will go inside the room. Well, what about one of us being hidden down there, ready to bolt them into the room? Then we can either go off in their motorboat, or our own boat if they bring back the oars, and get help." Anne thought it was a marvellous idea, but Dick and George did not look so certain. "We'd have to go down and bolt the door again to make it seem as if we are still prisoners there," said George. "And suppose the one who hides down there doesn't manage to bolt the men in? It might be very difficult to do that quickly enough. They will simply catch whoever we plan to leave down there,
and then come up to look for the rest of us."
"That's true," said Julian thoughtfully. "Well, we'll suppose that Dick, or whoever goes down, doesn't manage to bolt them in and make them prisoners, and the men come up here again. All right. While they're down there, we'll pile big stones over the entrance just as they did. Then they won't be able to get out."
"What about Dick down below?" said Anne at once.
"I could climb up the well again," said Dick eagerly. "I'll be the one to go down and hide. I'll do my best to bolt the men into the room, and if I have to escape, I'll climb up the well shaft again. The men don't know about that, so even if they are not prisoners in the dungeon room, they'll be prisoners underground." The children talked over the plan and decided that it was the best they could think of. Then George said she thought it would be a good thing to have a meal. They were all half-starved, and now that the worry and excitement of the rescue was over, they were feeling very hungry. They fetched some food from the little room and ate in the cove, keeping a sharp lookout for the return of the men. After about 2 hours, they saw a big fishing smack appear in the distance and heard the chug-chug-chug of a motorboat too. "There they are," said Julian, and he jumped to his feet. "That's the ship they mean to load with the ingots and sail away in. And there's the motorboat bringing the men back. Quick, Dick, down the well you go, and hide until you hear them in the dungeons." Dick shot off. Julian turned to the others. "We'll have to hide," he said. "Now that the tide is out, we'll hide over there, behind those uncovered rocks. I don't somehow think the men will do any hunting for Dick and Anne, but they might. Come on, quick." They hid themselves behind the rocks and heard the motorboat come chugging into the tiny harbour. They could hear men calling to one another. There seemed to be more than 2 of them this time. Then the men left the inlet and went up the low cliff towards the ruined castle. Julian crept behind the rocks, but he couldn't see what they were doing. He felt certain that they were pulling away the slabs of stone which they had piled on top of the entrance to prevent Dick and Anne from going down to rescue him and George. "George, come on," called Julian in a low tone. "I think the men will have gone down the steps into the dungeons by now. We must go and try to put those big stones back. Quick!" George, Julian and Anne ran softly and swiftly to the old courtyard of the castle. They saw that the stones had been pulled away from the entrance to the dungeons. The men had disappeared. They had plainly gone down the steps. The 3 children did their best to tug at the heavy stones to drag them back, but their strength was not the same as that of the men, and they couldn't manage to get any very big stones across. They put 3 smaller ones across, and Julian just hoped that the men would find them too difficult to move from below. "If only Dick has managed to bolt them into that room," he said to the others. "Come on, back to the well now. Dick will have to come up there because he won't be able to get out of the entrance." They all went to the well. Dick had removed the old wooden cover and it was lying on the ground. The children leaned over the hole of the well and waited anxiously. They could hear nothing and longed to know what was happening. There was plenty happening. The 2 men and another had gone down into the dungeons, expecting to find Julian, George and the dog still locked up with the ingots. They passed the well shaft, not guessing that a boy was hidden there, ready to slip out of the opening as soon as they had passed. Dick had already returned to the empty dungeon and bolted the door. If he hadn't done that, the men would have seen the unbolted door and would have known that Julian and George had escaped. Dick heard them pass. He slipped out of the well opening and followed behind, his feet making no sound. He could see the beams made by the men's powerful torches. With his heart thumping loudly, he crept along the smelly old passages between great caves until the men turned into the wide passage where the store cave lay. "Here it is," Dick heard one of the men say as he flashed his torch onto the great door. "The gold's in there. So are the kids." The man unbolted the door at top and bottom. He opened the door and stepped inside. The second man followed him. Dick crept as close as he dared, waiting for the third man to go in too. Then he meant to slam the door and bolt it. The first man swung his torch round. "The children are gone,"
he exclaimed. "Where are they?" 2 of the men were now inside, and the third stepped in at that moment. Dick darted forward and slammed the door. It made a crash that went echoing round and round the caves and passages. Dick fumbled with the bolts, his hands trembling. The bolts were stiff and rusty. The boy found it hard to shoot them home, and meanwhile the men were not idle. As soon as they heard the door slam, they spun round. The third man put his shoulder to the door and heaved. Dick had just got one of the bolts almost into its socket. Then all 3 men put their strength against the door, and the bolt gave way. Dick stared in horror. The door was opening. He turned and fled down the dark passage. The men flashed their torches on and saw him. They went after the boy at top speed. Dick fled to the well shaft. Fortunately, the opening was on the far side, and he could clamber into it without being seen in the light of the torches. He only just had time to squeeze through before the 3 men came running by. Not one of them guessed that the runaway was hidden in the well shaft. Indeed, the men didn't even know that there was a well shaft there. Trembling from head to foot, Dick began to climb the rope he had left dangling from the iron ladder. He undid it when he reached the ladder itself, for he thought that the men might discover the old well and try to climb up later. The boy climbed up the ladder quickly and squeezed round the stone slab near the top. The other children were there waiting for him. They pulled him out quickly. They knew at once by the look on his face that he had failed in what he'd tried to do. "It was no good," said Dick, panting with his climb. "I couldn't do it. They burst the door open just as I was bolting it and chased me. I got into the shaft just in time." "They're trying to get out of the entrance now," cried Anne suddenly. "Quick! What shall we do? They'll catch all of us." "To the boat!" shouted Julian, and he took Anne's hand to help her along. "Come along! It's our only chance. The men may be able to move those stones." The 4 children fled down the courtyard. George darted into the little stone room as they passed it and caught up an axe. Tim dashed along with them, barking madly. They came to the cove. Their own boat lay there. The motorboat was there too. George jumped into the motorboat and gave a yell of delight. "Here are our oars. Take them, Julian. I've got a job to do here. Get our boat down to the water, quick." Julian and Dick took the oars. They dragged their boat down to the water, wondering what George was doing. All kinds of crashing sounds came from the motorboat.
"George! George, back up! The men are out!"
Julian yelled suddenly. He had seen the 3 men running to the cliff that led down to the cove. George leapt out of the motorboat and joined the others. They pushed their boat out onto the water, and George took the oars at once, pulling for all she was worth. The 3 men ran to their motorboat. There they paused in the greatest dismay, for George had completely ruined it. With her axe, she had smashed all the machinery she could see, and now the boat couldn't possibly be started. It was damaged beyond any repair the men could make with the few tools they had with them.
"You wicked girl!"
yelled Jake, shaking his fist at George.
"Wait till I get you!"
"I'll wait!" George shouted back, her blue eyes shining dangerously.
"And you can wait too!"
The 3 men stood at the edge of the sea, watching George pull away strongly from the shore. They could do nothing. "The fishing smack they've got waiting out there is too big to use in that little inlet," said George. "They'll have to stay there till somebody goes in with a boat. I guess they're as wild as can be." They had to pass fairly near to the big fishing boat. A man hailed them as they came by.
"Ahoy there! Have you come from Kirin Island?"
"Don't answer," said George. "Don't say a word."
"Ahoy there!"
yelled the man angrily.
"Are you deaf? Have you come from the island?"
Still the children said nothing at all, while George rowed steadily. The man on the ship gave it up and looked towards the island. He felt sure the children had come from there, and he knew enough of his comrades' adventures to wonder if everything was right on the island. "He may put out a boat from the smack and go and see what's happening," said George. "Well, he can't do much except take the men off with a few ingots. I hardly dare think they'll take any of the gold, though, now that we've escaped to tell our tale." Julian looked behind at the ship. After a time, he saw that the little boat it carried was being lowered into the sea.
You're right, he said to George. They're afraid something is up. They're going to rescue those 3 men. What a pity.
The children's boat reached the mainland. They leapt out into the shallow water and dragged it up the beach. Tim pulled at the rope too, wagging his tail. He loved to join in anything that the children were doing.
Shall you take Tim to Alf? Asked Dick.
George shook her head.
No, she said. We haven't any time to waste. We must go and tell my parents everything that has happened. I'll tie Tim up to the fence.
They made their way to Kirin Cottage at top speed. Aunt Fanny was gardening. She stared in surprise at the hurrying children.
Why, she said, I thought you were not coming back till tomorrow or the next day. Has anything happened? What's the matter with Dick's cheek?
Nothing much, said Dick. The others chimed in.
Aunt Fanny, where's Uncle Quentin? We have something important to tell him. Mother, we've had such an adventure. Aunt Fanny, we have an awful lot to tell you. We really have.
Aunt Fanny looked at the untidy children in amazement.
Whatever has happened? She said.
Then she turned towards the house and called,
Quentin! Quentin! The children have something to tell us.
Uncle Quentin came out, looking rather cross, for he was in the middle of his work.
What's the matter? He asked.
Uncle, it's about Kirin Island, said Julian eagerly. Those men haven't bought it yet, have they?
Well, it's practically sold, said his uncle. I've signed my part, and they are to sign tomorrow. Why?
Uncle, those men won't sign tomorrow, said Julian. Do you know why they wanted to buy the island and the castle? Not because they really wanted to build a hotel or anything like that, but because they knew the lost gold was hidden there.
What nonsense are you talking? Said his uncle.
It isn't nonsense, Father, cried George. It's all true. The map of the old castle was in that box you sold, and the map showed where the ingots were hidden by my great-great-great-grandfather.
George's father looked amazed and annoyed. He simply didn't believe a word. But his wife saw by the solemn and serious faces of the 4 children that something important really had happened. And then Anne suddenly burst into loud sobs. She couldn't bear to think that her uncle wouldn't believe them.
Aunt Fanny, it's all true, she sobbed. Oh, Aunt Fanny, the man had a revolver and, he made Julian and George prisoners in the dungeons and Dick had to climb down the well to rescue them and George has smashed up their motorboat to stop them escaping.
Her uncle and aunt couldn't make head or tail of this. But Uncle Quentin suddenly seemed to think that the matter was serious and worth looking into.
Smashed up a motorboat, he said. Whatever for? Come indoors. I shall have to hear the story from beginning to end.
They all trooped indoors. Anne sat on her aunt's knee and listened to George and Julian telling the whole story. They told it well and left nothing out. Aunt Fanny grew quite pale as she listened, especially when she heard about Dick climbing down the well.
You might have been killed. Oh, Dick, what a brave thing to do.
Uncle Quentin listened in the utmost amazement. He had never had much liking or admiration for any children. He'd always thought they were noisy, tiresome and silly. But now, as he listened, he changed his mind about these 4.
You've been very clever, he said. And very brave, too. I'm proud of you. Yes, I'm very proud of you all. No wonder you didn't want me to sell the island, George, when you knew about the ingots. But why didn't you tell me?
The 4 children stared at him and didn't answer. They couldn't very well say, well, firstly, you wouldn't have believed us. Secondly, you're bad-tempered and unjust, and we're frightened of you. And thirdly, we didn't trust you enough to do the right thing.
Why don't you answer? Said their uncle.
His wife answered for them in a gentle voice.
Quentin, you scare the children, you know, and I don't expect they liked to go to you. But now that they have, you must ring up the police and see what they have to say about all this.
Right, said Uncle Quentin, and he got up at once. He patted Julian on the back.
You've all done well, he said.
Then he ruffled George's short curly hair.
And I'm proud of you too, George, he said. You're as good as a boy, any day.
Oh, Father, said George,
going red with surprise and pleasure. She smiled at him, and he smiled back. The children noticed that he had a very nice face when he smiled. He and George were really very alike to look at. Both looked ugly when they sulked and frowned, and both were good to look at when they laughed or smiled. George's father went off to telephone the police, and his lawyers too. The children sat and ate biscuits and plums, telling their aunt a great many little details they had forgotten when telling the story before. As they sat there came a loud and angry bark from the front garden. George looked up. "That's Tim," she said, with an anxious look at her mother. "I hadn't time to take him to Alf, who keeps him for me, Mother. Tim was such a comfort to us on the island, you know. I'm sorry he's barking now, but I expect he's hungry." "Well, fetch him in," said her mother unexpectedly. "He's quite a hero too. We must give him a good dinner." George sped out of the door and went to Tim. She set him free, and he came bounding indoors, wagging his long tail. He licked George's mother and cocked his ears at her. "Good dog," she said, and actually patted him. "I'll get you some dinner." Tim trotted out to the kitchen with her. Julian grinned at George. "Well, look at that," he said. "Your mother's a brick, isn't she?" "Yes, but I don't know what Father will say when he sees Tim in the house again," said George. At that moment her father came back, his face grave. "The police take a serious view of this," he said, "and so does my lawyer. They all agree that you children have been remarkably clever and brave. And, George, my lawyer says that the ingots definitely belong to us. Are there really a lot?" "Father, there are hundreds," said George. "Simply hundreds, all in a big pile in the dungeon. Oh, Father, shall we be rich now?" "Yes," said her father, "we shall. Rich enough to give you and your mother all the things I've longed to give you for so many years and couldn't. Oh, I've worked hard enough for you, but it's not the kind of work that brings in a lot of money, and so I've become irritable and bad-tempered. But now you shall have everything you want." "I don't really want anything I haven't already got," said George. "But, Father, there is one thing I'd like more than anything else in the world, and it won't cost you a penny." "You shall have it, my dear," said her father, slipping his arm round George. "Just say what it is, and you shall have it." Just then there came the pattering of big feet down the passage towards the room they were in. A big, hairy head pushed itself through the door and looked inquiringly at everybody there. Uncle Quentin stared in surprise. "Why, isn't that Tim?" he asked. "Hello, Tim." "Father, Tim is the thing I want most in all the world," said George, squeezing her father's arm. "You can't think what a friend he was to us on the island, and he wanted to fly at those men and fight them. Oh, Father, I don't want any other present. I only want to keep Tim and have him here for my very own. We could afford to give him a proper kennel to sleep in now, and I'd see that he didn't disturb you. I really would." "Well, of course you can have him," said her father, and Tim came right into the room at once, wagging his tail, looking for all the world as if he'd understood every word that had been said. He actually licked Uncle Quentin's hand. Anne thought that very brave. But Uncle Quentin was quite different now. It seemed as if a great weight had been lifted off his shoulders. They were rich now. George could go to a good school, and his wife could have the things he had so much wanted her to have. And he would be able to go on with the work he loved without feeling that he was not earning enough to keep his family in comfort. He beamed, looking as jolly a person as anyone could wish. George flung her arms round her father's neck and hugged him, a thing she had not done for a long time. He looked astonished, but very pleased. "Hello," he said. "Is this the police already?" It was. They came up to the door and had a few words with Uncle Quentin. Then one stayed behind to take down the children's story in his notebook, and the others went off to get a boat to the island. The men had gone. The boat from the fishing smack had fetched them away, and now both ship and boat had disappeared. The motorboat was still there,
but quite unusable. The inspector looked at it with a grin.
"Fierce young lady, isn't she, that Miss Georgina?" he said. "Done this job pretty well. No one could get away in this boat. We'll have to get it towed into harbour."
The police brought back with them some of the ingots of gold to show Uncle Quentin. They had sealed up the door of the dungeon so that no one else could get in until he was ready to go and fetch the gold. Everything was being done thoroughly and properly, though far too slowly for the children. They had hoped that the men would have been caught and taken to prison, and that the police would bring back all the gold at once. They were all very tired that night, and didn't make any fuss at all when their aunt told them they must go to bed early. They undressed, and then the boys went to eat their supper in the girls' bedroom. Tim was there, ready to lick up any fallen crumbs.
"Well, I must say, we've had a wonderful adventure," said Julian sleepily. "In a way, I'm sorry it's ended, though at times I didn't enjoy it very much, especially when you and I, George, were prisoners in that dungeon."
George was looking very happy as she nibbled her gingerbread biscuits. She grinned at Julian.
"And to think I hated the idea of you all coming here to stay," she said. "I was going to be such a beast to you. I was going to make you wish you were all home again. And now the only thing that makes me sad is the idea of you going away, which you will do, of course, when the holidays end, and I'll be on my own again. I've never been lonely before, but I know I shall be now." "No, you won't," said Anne suddenly. "You can do something that will stop you being lonely ever again."
"What?" said George.
"You can ask to go to the same boarding school as I go to," said Anne. "It's such a lovely one, and we're allowed to keep our pets, so Tim could come too."
"Gracious! Could he really?" said George, her eyes shining.
"Well, I'll go then. I always said I wouldn't, but I will because I see now how much better it is to be with others than all by myself. And if I can have Tim, well, that's simply wonderful."
"You'd better go back to your own bedroom now, boys," said Aunt Fanny, appearing at the doorway. "Look at Dick almost dropping with sleep. Well, you should all have pleasant dreams tonight, for you've had an adventure to be proud of. George, is that Tim under your bed?"
"Well, yes it is, Mother," said George, pretending to be surprised. "Dear me! Tim, what are you doing here?"
Tim crawled out and went over to George's mother. He lay flat on his tummy and looked up at her most appealingly out of his soft brown eyes. "Do you want to sleep in the girls' room tonight?" said George's mother with a laugh. "All right, just for once."
"Mother!" yelled George. "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. Tim, you can sleep on the rug over there."
4 happy children snuggled down into their beds. Their wonderful adventure had come to a happy end. They had plenty of holidays still in front of them. George had Tim for her own again. Everything was marvellous.
"I'm so glad Kirin Island wasn't sold, George," said Anne sleepily. "I'm so glad it still belongs to you." "It belongs to 3 other people too," said George. "It belongs to me, and to you, and Julian, and Dick. I've discovered that it's fun to share things, so tomorrow I'm going to draw up a deed, or whatever it's called, and put in it that I give you and the others a 1/4 share each. Kirin Island and Castle shall belong to us all." "Oh, George, how lovely," said Anne. "Won't the boys be pleased? I do feel so
But before she could finish, the little girl was asleep, and so was George. In the other room, the 2 boys slept too, dreaming of ingots and dungeons and all kinds of exciting things. Only one person was awake, and that was Tim. He had one ear up and was listening to the children's breathing. As soon as he knew they were asleep, he got up quietly from his rug. He crept softly over to George's bed. He put his front paws up and sniffed at the sleeping girl. Then, with a bound, he was on the bed
and snuggled himself down into the crook of her legs. He gave a sigh and shut his eyes. The 4 children might be happy, but Tim was happiest of all.